This is Shadows in the Halls, written by André Paolin, narrated by Jenica Domanico. Archivum at nightfall. The carriage lurched as a loose cobblestone caught the wheels, throwing me against the worn leather seat. I grabbed the window frame to steady myself, feeling cold seep through the glass as mist rose from the lake lucht on both sides of the narrow causeway.
"Damn treacherous road,"
the driver muttered from his perch above, his voice carrying through the thin roof.
"Should have charged double for this passage."
I pressed my face to the rain-streaked window, watching cattails bend and sway in the autumn wind. The tall reeds whispered as we passed, their heads heavy with moisture. Droplets clung to the glass, distorting the marshlands that stretched either way. The wheels scraped the wet stones with each turn, a harsh sound that made my teeth ache. I felt every bump in the ancient causeway through the thin cushions, each jolt reminding me how precarious our position on this narrow strip of civilization was. "How much further?" I called up.
"Can't rightly say in this fog,"
he replied, voice tight with concentration.
"Might be an hour, might be two. This mist plays tricks. Makes the world fold in on itself."
The causeway stretched ahead like a thin ribbon, vanishing into morning haze. On either side, waters lapped at the stone foundations, muffled by the thick air. It felt as though we were traveling through a world that had forgotten sunlight and warmth. I pulled my cloak tighter and settled back, watching marsh grass and cattails through the streaked glass. The wilderness swallowed every sound except the wheels grinding and the driver's occasional curse when we hit a rough patch. The carriage wheels stopped grinding against stone. Through the settling dust, I glimpsed the end of our journey, a stone bridge spanning the last stretch of water before solid ground. The driver's relieved exhale told me we'd reached the academy's boundary. 2 academy wardens stepped from the guardhouse beside the bridge wardens of the rector's causeway, keepers of the candle ledger and the seals that governed arrivals. The taller, broad-shouldered man with a scar at his jaw took the papers. His partner, a precise ledger keeper with ink-stained fingers, hovered by a leather-bound book of entries.
"Papers?"
Sergeant Hale said as I stepped down onto the bridge's weathered stones. I handed over my enrollment documents, expecting the cursory glance most checkpoints required. Instead, he held each page up to the gray light, examining the parchment as if searching for hidden messages. He traced the Academy's wax seal, pressing gently to test its authenticity.
"First time at Blackwood?"
he asked, though his eyes never left my papers. "Yes, ma'am," I said, low and steady. Clerk Mott joined us, opened his ledger to a marked page and ran his finger down a column of names. The arrival registry kept by the wardens each morning.
"Blackwell,"
he murmured to his partner.
"Here it is."
They exchanged a look I couldn't quite read. Hale folded my papers carefully, then unfolded them again to check the signatures a second time. Mott consulted the ledger once more, whispered something that made him nod slowly.
"Everything checks out,"
Hale said at last, but he didn't return my papers immediately. He looked me over, like someone cataloging a detail that might matter later.
"Head straight to the main hall for orientation. Don't wander the grounds alone. It's easy to get lost your first day."
Mott closed his ledger with a soft thud.
"Welcome to Blackwood Academy, Miss Blackwell."
They handed my papers back, though their gazes lingered as I climbed into the carriage. Through the window, I watched them retreat to their guardhouse. Hale glanced back twice before disappearing inside. The driver clicked his tongue, and we rolled forward across the bridge. But I couldn't shake the feeling that those wardens had been memorizing more than just my documents. The carriage wheels found their rhythm against the cobblestones as we crossed the bridge, leaving the wardens and their watchful eyes behind. The path ahead curved upward through thickening fog, winding toward what I could only glimpse through the mist. Dark shapes suggesting towers and walls rising from the hillside like broken teeth.
"First time at Blackwood?"
the driver called back, his voice cutting through the clatter of hooves. Yes. I kept my answer short, still unsettled by the checkpoint encounter. He grunted.
"You'll know when you see it proper. Been driving this route 15 years, and those towers still give me the shivers on mornings like this."
The carriage lurched over a rough patch of stones. I gripped the window frame and peered out, trying to make sense of the shapes emerging from the fog. What had seemed like distant shadows took form. Massive walls of dark stone, streaked by centuries of rain and weather. Windows punctured the walls at irregular intervals, narrow slits that watched our approach with hollow indifference.
"There she is," he muttered. "Blackwood Academy."
The Gothic towers pierced the fog now, their pointed spires disappearing into the gray. The architecture felt ancient, predatory, as if the buildings had grown from the hillside rather than been built upon it. Each stone seemed placed to cast shadows, to hide corners, to suggest secrets just beyond sight. The carriage slowed as we reached the main courtyard. Through the mist, I made out other buildings, dormitories perhaps, or classrooms, all of the same dark stone, all sharing that watchful silence.
"End of the line, miss,"
he announced, pulling the horses to a stop. I gathered my belongings and stepped onto the cobbles, my boots clicking against the wet stone. He handed down my trunk with practiced efficiency, then climbed back up.
"Good luck to you,"
he said, though his tone implied I might need more than luck. With a snap of the reins, he turned the carriage and disappeared back into the fog, leaving me alone in the courtyard. The silence pressed against me immediately. Not the peaceful quiet of countryside, but something heavier, more deliberate. The walls loomed overhead, their dark stone seeming to absorb the little light that filtered through the fog. I felt the weight of the architecture. Not just the mass of carved stone and timber, but something deeper, as if the walls held memories that made the air thick and watchful. A bell tolled in the distance, its deep note echoing off the stone and fading into the mist. I picked up my trunk and headed for the main hall, my footsteps echoing in the courtyard. Each step felt measured, observed, as if the academy itself took my measure. The fog swirled around the towers, and for a moment I thought I saw faces in the narrow windows, pale shapes that vanished the instant I looked directly at them. When I blinked and looked again, there was nothing but empty glass reflecting the gray morning light. The heavy oak doors of the main hall swung shut behind me with a sound that lingered longer than it should have. I stood in a vast entrance hall where my footsteps took on a strange quality, each step both muffled and amplified, as if the stone walls couldn't decide whether to swallow sound or throw it back at me. The silence here felt different from the courtyard's fog-muted quiet. It pressed against my ears with an expectant weight, broken only by the distant scratch of quills on parchment and the soft whisper of pages turning somewhere in the depths of the building. These noises came from rooms I couldn't see, carried through corridors that stretched away from the entrance hall like arteries branching from a heart. I shifted the trunk to my other hand and walked deeper into the academy. The corridor ahead seemed to stretch impossibly long, lined with portraits that made my skin prickle. The painted faces belonged to scholars from decades past, their eyes following my movement with an intensity that made me want to quicken my pace. One portrait in particular, a severe-looking woman with hair, tracked me so closely that I glanced back to make sure she hadn't stepped from her frame. Unsettling, aren't they? I jumped, nearly dropping the trunk. A girl about my age had emerged from one of the alcoves that dotted the corridor, her sudden presence so unexpected that my heart hammered against my ribs. "I'm sorry," she said, though she didn't look particularly sorry. "I didn't mean to startle you. I'm Celine Ashcroft." Willowy and pale, hair cut just below her jaw, her glassy eyes seemed to look past me. Her movements were small and careful, a high-collared sweater and a coat drawing her into the corridor's shadows. A thin silver locket rested on her throat. When she spoke, it was in precise, quiet fragments, as if measuring each word. "Adeline Blackwell." I set the trunk down, grateful for the excuse to catch my breath. "How long have you been standing there?" "Not long." Celine's voice carried a particular quality, as if she were listening to something I couldn't hear. "The portraits do that to everyone at first. You get used to it." I looked back at the stern woman's portrait. The painted eyes seemed to bore into me with renewed interest now that I'd acknowledged them. "Do you really?" "No," Celine admitted softly, pausing as if the locket at her throat had something to say, and she were only letting it finish. "But you learn to act like you do." The morning light filtering through the tall windows cast long shadows across the worn stone floor beneath our feet. I could feel the smoothness of the stone through the soles of my shoes. Generations of students had walked these same corridors, wearing the surface down with their daily passages. The thought should have been comforting, but instead it made me feel small and temporary, just another pair of feet adding to the endless wearing away. "Are you heading to the dormitories?" she asked. "I suppose I am, though I'm not entirely sure where they are." "This way." She pointed down a narrow side corridor I'd almost missed. "The main hall tricks people. Some passages promise one thing and give another. Others pretend to be closed and then open." As we walked, I noticed how the shadows gathered in the alcoves, despite the morning light streaming through the windows. Each recessed space held its own pocket of darkness, as if the architecture itself created hiding places for things that preferred not to be seen. "How long have you been here?" I asked. "Second year," Celine answered after a small pause, listening as if the corridor might correct her. "Long enough to learn the rhythms. The place shows you what it wants, on its own time." The corridor opened into a wider hall where voices mingled with the shuffled footsteps. Celine paused at the threshold, touching my arm. "Orientation," she said simply. "They'll expect you there." The orientation hall stretched before us, its vaulted ceiling disappearing into shadows despite the tall windows that lined the walls. Students clustered in loose groups, some seated on benches, others near the walls. At the front, a man in dark robes spoke with measured authority about the academy's traditions and expectations. I only half listened to his words about academic rigor and scholarly pursuit. My attention drifted across the sea of faces. Most looked my age, though a few were younger, their expressions carrying the same mixture of curiosity and apprehension I felt. Some whispered to companions they'd already found. Others stood alone, studying the room as I was.
"The library houses over 10,000 volumes,"
the speaker continued,
"many of which exist nowhere else in the civilized world."
A murmur of appreciation rippled through the crowd, but my focus had already shifted to a figure near the center of the hall. I had noticed him before the rector finished speaking, a tall, lean student with coal dark hair and a posture that suggested he had measured the room and found its angles. His pale eyes surveyed patiently. Charm hung about him like a tailored coat. There was polish in his gestures, an ease sharpened by calculation, the sort of confidence that draws a circle and invites you to step inside. I would later learn his name, Nathaniel Crowhurst, and that he wore his courtesy like an instrument, tuned to the person before him. He stood slightly apart where he could see and be seen. When he replied to something another student had whispered, his voice carried clearly across the space. The words were unremarkable, something about the journey here, but the delivery was too practiced for someone our age.
Each of you has been selected for your particular talents,
the robed figure at the front announced.
The Academy does not accept students lightly.
Nathaniel smiled at this, an expression that seemed to acknowledge some private understanding. His pale eyes swept the room in a slow, deliberate arc, and I had the distinct impression he was cataloging each face, filing details for future use. When his gaze passed over me, it lingered a beat longer before moving on. There was something magnetic about him. Other students drifted slightly in his direction without realizing it. Yet beneath that charisma, I sensed calculation. The way he positioned himself, the timing of his contributions, even the angle of his shoulders. Everything seemed designed to create maximum impact.
Questions will be addressed during individual meetings with your assigned mentors,
the speaker concluded.
For now, familiarize yourselves with your fellow scholars.
As the formal presentation ended and students began to move about, I watched Nathaniel take a nervous-looking boy's hand.
Nathaniel Crowhurst, he said, warm and welcoming. And you are?
The boy stammered his name, clearly flattered. Within moments, Nathaniel had drawn two others into the conversation, his smile never wavering, his questions calibrated to put each person at ease, while revealing just enough about them to be useful. I felt both impressed and unsettled by the performance, for that's what it was, I realized, a carefully orchestrated display of charm designed to establish connections and influence. The kind of social maneuvering that came naturally to some people, but in his case felt too deliberate, too refined.
"He's good at that,"
Celine said quietly beside me. I hadn't noticed her return, but she watched him with the same careful attention I'd paid. At what? I asked.
"Making people feel important."
Celine's voice was low, each word measured as if turning over a small, sharp stone.
"He frames them so they talk, gives them the illusion they're leading. It's how he gathers favors without anyone knowing they've given them."
I turned to look at her more carefully. Celine sat with her back straight against the chair, but there was something fragile about the way she held herself, as if she might break if someone spoke too loudly. Her hair fell in a sharp line just below her jaw, framing a face that was all angles and shadows. When she caught me studying her, those eyes didn't look away. They looked through me, past me, as if I were made of glass myself.
"You watch people too,"
she said. It wasn't a question. "I suppose I do." She touched the locket at her throat, pressing it as if it might disappear. The gesture was so automatic, I wondered if she even knew she was doing it.
"Most people here don't," she continued, whispering. "They talk and laugh and make friends like it's the easiest thing in the world."
I glanced around the orientation hall. She was right. The other students had formed loose clusters, chatting about their journeys to the academy or speculating about their dormitory assignments. Their conversations flowed naturally, punctuated by easy laughter. It looked effortless. Does that bother you? I asked. Celine was quiet for a long moment, her thumb tracing the edge of the locket.
It used to, she said finally. Now I think they just don't see what we see.
Which is?
That everyone's performing.
Her eyes shifted to Nathaniel Crowhurst, tall, lean, all easy charm and measured gestures, who had gathered a small court of first-years, his voice pitched to make confidences feel earned. He was speaking with a group of younger students, hands gesturing as he told some story that had them hanging on every word.
Him especially, but all of them really. They're all trying to be someone they think they should be.
I watched Nathaniel lean in, his voice dropping to draw them in. One of the girls laughed, her cheeks flushing. He smiled at her reaction, but there was something calculating in the way he catalogued it. And us? I asked. What are we doing? Her grip on the locket tightened.
Trying not to be seen at all.
The observation hit closer to home than I wanted to admit. I had chosen a seat near the wall, close enough to observe, but far enough to avoid drawing attention. I hadn't answered any of the orientation questions, hadn't introduced myself to anyone beyond the basic pleasantries. Even now, talking with Celine felt like stepping onto ice that might crack. Is that why you sit back here? I asked.
Partly.
She paused, her gaze drifting to the tall windows where morning light filtered through.
But also because I can see everything from here. All the exits, all the faces. It's safer.
Safer from what? She looked at me, really looked at me, and for a moment those eyes focused with startling intensity.
From making the kind of mistakes that follow you.
She spoke softly, each word careful and precise. Before I could ask what she meant, one of the academy staff, a stern woman with hair pulled into a tight bun, clapped for attention.
Students, if you would please gather your belongings, we'll be moving to the dormitories for room assignments.
Around us, chairs scraped as students stood and collected their things. Celine rose slowly, deliberate. She shouldered a small satchel and waited for me to stand.
You'll want to stay close, she said quietly. The dormitory assignments aren't random. They put certain people together for reasons.
What kind of reasons? But she was already moving toward the door, her slight frame drifting through the crowd like smoke. I hurried to follow, that familiar unease settling in my stomach. Everything about this place, the watchful portraits, the thorough guards, the careful way Celine spoke, felt like a warning I wasn't quite able to read. Whispers in the margins. 3 days had passed since orientation, and the Archivum's reading room felt like a different place entirely after dark. Shadows pooled thick between the towering shelves, and the handful of students bent over their texts worked by flickering candlelight that cast everything in amber and black. The silence was heavier here, broken only by the occasional rustle of turning pages or the soft scratch of a quill against parchment. I had claimed a corner table near the restricted section, close enough to feel the weight of those forbidden volumes, but far enough to avoid drawing attention. My assigned readings lay spread before me, dense treatises on historical methodology and archival theory that made my eyes burn even in the forgiving candlelight. The words kept blurring together, but I forced myself to focus. 3 days in, and I was already falling behind. The sharp scrape of a chair pushed back suddenly cut through the quiet like a blade. I looked up. Celine stood beside her desk, swaying on her feet, one hand pressed to her temple, fingers white with pressure, while the other reached into empty air as if trying to grasp something only she could see. Her face had gone ashen, color drained from cheeks and lips. "Celine," I whispered, but she didn't seem to hear me. Her lips trembled, forming words I couldn't catch. Her eyes were wide and unfocused, fixed on something beyond the candlelit room. The other students hadn't noticed yet. They were too absorbed in their work, heads bent over their books. I started to rise, but before I could take a step, her knees buckled. She crumpled to the floor like a marionette with severed strings, still clutching at nothing. I reached her as she hit the floor, catching her shoulders before her head struck. The impact jarred my arms, but I broke her fall and pulled her back against me as we sank to our knees. "Celine," I whispered, but she didn't answer. Her body shook against mine, violent tremors from deep in her bones. Her fingers found my forearms and dug in, nails biting through my sleeves. The pain was sharp, but I didn't pull away. Her eyes were what frightened me most. Wide, utterly terrified, they stared past me at something I couldn't see. The look made my stomach drop. I had seen that expression before. In my sister's final weeks, the awful mix of confusion and dread, as if she could perceive some approaching horror invisible to everyone else. "What is it?" I asked, keeping my voice low so the other students wouldn't hear. "What do you see?" Her lips moved frantically, words spilling in broken fragments.
"The margins," she whispered, voice thin and trembling. "They're bleeding through. Can't you see them?"
I glanced around the reading room. Everything looked normal. Shelves of ancient books, flickering candles, students bent over their work. "I don't see anything," I said gently. "You're safe. You're in the archivum."
No.
She dug in harder, knuckles whitening.
"Beneath the floor. They're calling. They've been calling for so long."
Her breaths came quick, shallow.
"The foundation cracks. It always cracks."
My chest tightened with a familiar dread. These weren't the ramblings of someone fainting. There was an urgency in her words, a coherence behind the chaos that reminded me too much of my sister's final days. The way she'd spoken about shadows moving in empty rooms, about voices only she could hear. "Look at me," I shifted to meet her face. "You're having an episode. Breathe with me, slowly, in and out." But her eyes stayed fixed on that invisible thing beyond my shoulder, and her whispers kept coming, each one more fragile and urgent than the last. Her breathing steadied against my shoulder, the violent trembling that had seized her body ebbing away. I felt her grip on my arms loosen, though she didn't let go entirely, as if she needed that anchor to keep from drifting back into whatever darkness had claimed her.
"The margins,"
she whispered, hoarse and fractured.
"And the old codices. The symbols in the margins."
I kept my voice low and steady. "What about them?" She pulled back slightly to meet my eyes, though hers kept darting toward the restricted shelves.
"They move. When I look directly at them, they writhe, like they're alive."
The way she said it, not with the breathless excitement of someone sharing a fascinating discovery, but with the hollow dread of someone confessing a terrible secret, made my stomach clench.
"That's when it happens,"
she continued, each word careful, as if speaking too quickly might summon whatever haunted her.
"The episodes. Something tries to get inside my head. I can feel it crawling through my thoughts."
I wanted to ask which texts, which symbols, but something in her expression warned me off. The terror in her eyes was too raw, too familiar. It was the same look I'd seen on my sister's face during those final weeks, that awful isolation of carrying knowledge that others dismissed as imagination or illness. "You won't tell me which books," I said. It wasn't a question. She shook her head, glancing again toward the restricted section. The quick, involuntary movement told me everything I needed to know. Whatever she'd been reading wasn't from the general collection.
"I can't," she said. "Not here. Not now."
The silence stretched between us, heavy with unspoken understanding. I recognized the weight she carried, the burden of seeing things others couldn't, of knowing things others wouldn't believe. It was a loneliness I understood too well. "How long has this been happening?" I asked.
"Since my second week here."
Her voice thinned to a thread.
"I thought I was going mad. The professors, they say it's stress, adjustment."
She let out a bitter short laugh.
"But you know what it's like when everyone thinks you're losing your mind."
I did know. The way people's expressions would shift when my sister tried to explain what she was experiencing. The careful, patronizing tone they'd use, as if speaking to a child having nightmares. "I believe you," I said simply. Relief broke across her face like a tide. She gripped my arms again, but this time her fingers were steady, not frantic.
"Thank you,"
she whispered, trembling but clear.
"God, thank you."
The other students gathered their materials with the quiet efficiency of those accustomed to late nights. Books closed with soft thuds, papers rustled as they were shuffled into neat stacks. And chairs scraped against stone as bodies rose and stretched. One by one, they filed past our corner, some casting curious glances at Celine's pale face before disappearing into the corridor beyond. Soon we were alone among the towering shelves, the silence broken only by the occasional pop and hiss of guttering candles. The flames cast restless shadows that seemed to writhe between the leather spines, making the restricted section appear even more forbidding in the dim light. I helped Celine back to her chair, my hand steady on her elbow as she settled into the seat. Her breathing had evened out, but I could still feel the tremor in her arm. I pulled my chair closer and sat beside her, our shoulders nearly touching. Neither of us spoke. The quiet stretched between us, heavy with unspoken questions and the weight of what had just passed. I studied her profile in the candlelight, the sharp line of her jaw, the way her fingers worried at the edge of her sleeve, how she held herself as if afraid any sudden movement might trigger another episode. Something about her collapse, those whispered warnings about margins bleeding through, had awakened a familiar desperation in my chest. It was the same need that had consumed me during my sister's disappearance, the absolute refusal to let another person slip away without understanding why, the refusal to stand by helpless while someone I cared about dissolved into confusion and terror. "The restricted section," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "You mentioned forbidden codices." Celine's gaze followed mine to the locked glass cases that lined the far wall. Even from here, I could see the heavy brass locks, the warning placards in Latin script, the way the books seemed to absorb rather than reflect the candlelight.
"I shouldn't have said that,"
she murmured, but her eyes remained fixed on those shelves. I leaned forward, studying the cases with new intensity. What secrets lay hidden behind that glass? What kind of knowledge could trigger the episodes Celine described? Could make symbols writhe and margins bleed? And what price did such knowledge extract from those who sought it? "But you did say it," I pressed gently, "and I meant what I said. I believe you." Her shoulders relaxed a fraction, and she turned to meet my eyes. In the flickering light, I saw something shift in her expression. A decision being made, a wall coming down.
"There are things in those books," she said, voice thin and slow, "that aren't meant for minds like ours. They change the way you see. They don't just teach you something. They rearrange what you can hold inside."
The silence stretched between us, heavy with the weight of her confession. I watched her face in the candlelight, searching for any sign she might say more, but Celine had already retreated behind that careful mask she wore so well. Still, when our paths crossed in the Archivum in the days that followed, she would sometimes take the seat beside me at the long reading table, close enough that her hand brushed mine as she handed me a folio, or offered a brief, almost inaudible,
"Thank you,"
before she buried her face in a volume and pretended nothing had happened. Those days blurred together in a haze of lectures and late-night reading. I found myself stealing glances at the restricted section whenever I was in the Archivum, wondering what lay behind those locked glass cases. We exchanged polite nods when our paths crossed, but outwardly she seemed determined to carry on as though our conversation had never occurred. Then came the summons. 4 days after that night in the Archivum, a folded note appeared on my desk bearing Professor Aldrich's precise handwriting. "Miss Blackwell, please attend my private study this afternoon at 3 o'clock. We have matters to discuss. T. Aldrich." Professor Thaddeus Aldrich, Blackwood's most exacting mind in hermeneutics, was already seated when I entered, posture pared to essentials, his eyes taking stock as if I were a specimen. Students spoke of his courtesy like a blade, always polished, always cutting. I had kept my distance in lecture halls. Distance, it seemed, no longer applied. The study was smaller than I expected, barely larger than a closet and crammed floor to ceiling with leather-bound volumes that seemed to lean inward from their shelves. Curious artifacts cluttered every available surface, bronze instruments I couldn't identify, carved stones that might have been ancient, glass vials filled with substances that caught the light strangely. Everything felt old and watchful, as if the room itself had been listening to conversations for decades. Professor Aldrich sat behind a massive oak desk that dominated the cramped space, his attention as methodical as when he examined ancient manuscripts during lectures. He was older than most of the other professors, late 50s, with hair swept back and the kind of sharp, angular features that made him look perpetually calculating. "Please sit," he said, gesturing to a chair positioned directly across from him. I sat in the worn leather seat, acutely aware of how the desk created a barrier between us. The chair was positioned just low enough that I had to look up at him slightly, a detail I was certain wasn't accidental. "Miss Blackwell," he began, steepling his fingers, "your work in my seminars has been noteworthy. Your essay on the evolution of protective ward structures showed a grasp of theoretical applications that exceeds what I typically see from first-year students."
"Thank you, Professor."
"Tell me about your previous studies. Before Blackwood, I mean. What drew you to archival work?" The question seemed innocent enough, but something in his tone made me choose my words carefully. "I've always been drawn to old texts. There's something about preserving knowledge that appeals to me." "And your family, are they scholars as well?" My throat tightened. "My parents died when I was young. I was raised by my aunt." "I see. And siblings?" The familiar ache twisted in my chest. "I had a sister. She died 3 years ago." Aldrich leaned forward slightly, and I caught a flicker of something in his expression. Not sympathy, but interest. "I'm sorry for your loss. Was she ill?" "She disappeared," I said, the words coming out sharper than I intended. "The authorities said she drowned, but they never found her body." "How tragic." He paused, as if considering something. "Loss can be a powerful motivator for scholarly pursuits, the desire to understand what we cannot control, to find meaning in chaos." I said nothing, unsettled by how easily he'd reduced my grief to an academic observation. "Which brings me to why I asked you here," Aldrich continued, settling back in his chair. "I've been observing your work, Miss Blackwell, and I believe you have the potential for more advanced studies. I'm prepared to offer you supervised access to certain restricted portions of the archive." My pulse quickened. "The restricted section?" "Selected materials, under careful guidance. Consider it both recognition of your aptitude and a test of your scholarly responsibility." His eyes never left my face. "Not every student is suited for such work. It requires discretion and a certain strength of mind." The way he said it made my skin crawl, but I forced myself to appear calm. "What kind of materials?" "Texts that deal with more esoteric aspects of our field. Historical accounts that some might find disturbing. Theoretical works that push the boundaries of conventional understanding." He paused. "Tell me, Miss Blackwell, how do you handle uncertainty when faced with knowledge that challenges your fundamental assumptions about the world?" I thought of Celine's trembling hands, her whispered warnings about margins that bled. I think the truth is worth pursuing, even when it's uncomfortable." "Even when it's dangerous?" "Even when it's dangerous?" The question hung in the air between us. I met his gaze steadily, though my heart was racing. "Knowledge itself isn't dangerous. It's what people do with it that matters." A smile played at the corners of his mouth. "Spoken like a true scholar. Very well, Miss Blackwell. I think we understand each other." He opened a drawer and withdrew a small brass key, setting it on the desk between us. "This will grant you access to Cabinet 7 in the restricted section. You may examine the contents during supervised study sessions, which we'll arrange at your convenience." I stared at the key, feeling as though I stood at the edge of a precipice. Every instinct told me to decline, to thank him politely and leave. But I thought of my sister, of all the questions that had never been answered, and of Celine's haunted eyes. "What's in Cabinet 7?" I asked. "Cases of disappearances and unusual phenomena," he said, his voice smoothing into that same cool, deliberate cadence. "Reports where ordinary explanations failed. Accounts that touch on anomalies. I thought, given your personal history, you might find them relevant." The room felt suddenly smaller, the watching artifacts more oppressive. He knew. Somehow he knew about my sister, about the questions that had driven me here. This wasn't recognition of my academic merit. It was recruitment. "Why me?" I asked quietly. "Because you've been looking in the right places," he said, folding his hands. "Because you notice what others let pass. I'm offering you a chance to follow that curiosity, with guidance, to see whether you can bear what you find." He moved to a locked drawer behind his desk and produced a small brass key from his waistcoat pocket. The lock clicked open with practiced ease, and he withdrew a ledger, its cover worn smooth by handling. Unlike the ancient tomes that filled his shelves, this book looked recent, utilitarian. This might clarify certain aspects of your situation here, he said, placing it before me on the desk. Internal documentation, not for general circulation. I opened the cover carefully. The pages were filled with organizational charts drawn in precise ink, formal descriptions typed on academy letterhead, lists of names and titles arranged in careful hierarchies. It looked like an institutional manual, the kind of dry administrative material that usually put me to sleep. But as I read, the structure that emerged was anything but ordinary. 3 internal designations, I said, tracing my finger down a particularly complex diagram. The threshold, the deep current, and the final margin. Not formal orders, Aldrich corrected before I could press. Those are program names, operational strata the Council uses in restricted files. Formally, work proceeds under the orders of philology, hermeneutics, and alteration. These labels are practical shorthand for certain cross-order initiatives. Explain. He put a fingertip on the page. The threshold denotes projects dealing with liminal problems, thresholds of inquiry, points of contact where conventional method strains at the edges. The deep current is ongoing investigative work, the slow, sustained studies. The final margin covers conclusions, codifications, matters to be sealed or retired. The chart showed layers upon layers of keepers, councils, and subcommittees, all connected by dotted lines and arrows that seemed designed to obscure rather than clarify. I squinted at the relationships, trying to follow the chains of authority. Who actually makes decisions? I asked, flipping to another page that showed the same information arranged differently, as if the Academy couldn't decide on its own structure. An excellent question. His tone was cool, formally amused. Authority flows through established channels. Which told me nothing. I continued reading, noting how certain positions were listed without names, how some departments appeared on one chart but not another, how the very language seemed calculated to raise more questions than it answered. This is deliberately incomplete, I said. Is it? He leaned back in his chair, watching me with that clinical interest I was beginning to recognize. Or perhaps it reflects the reality that some structures resist simple documentation. I turned another page, finding a section on research protocols and safety measures that was mostly blank except for a single line. Refer to individual program guidelines as appropriate. Below that, someone had handwritten in fading ink. Remember that knowledge has weight. What does that mean? Which part? Any of it, I nodded at the ledger. This whole thing reads like it was written by committee to avoid saying anything useful. Something flickered across his expression. Approval, perhaps. He smiled, small and practiced. You're observant, Miss Blackwell. That's precisely why I thought you might find this illuminating. He watched my reactions. Every frown, every question, every moment of confusion or frustration. He catalogued them the way one might note the gait of a horse, careful, patient, noting endurance and temperament. You're testing me, I said. I'm evaluating your potential usefulness, he replied, voice smooth and unhurried. The Academy needs people who can organize sensitive work without demanding inconvenient explanations. People who can operate inside flexible arrangements. I closed the ledger. And you think I'm that kind of person? I think you're the kind of person who wants answers badly enough to go looking for them, even when the searching means accepting certain uncomfortable truths. The afternoon light slanted through his window, casting long shadows across the cluttered shelves. I felt the weight of all those watching artifacts, the accumulated secrets of decades pressing down on the small space between us. What happens if I say no? Then you continue your studies as any other student would. You graduate, you leave, you find employment elsewhere. He paused, the stillness sharpened. And you never learn what happened to your sister. Of course, Aldrich closed the ledger with deliberate care. Take all the time you need, but remember, some opportunities don't present themselves twice. I left his study with my hands trembling and my thoughts in chaos. The corridor outside felt different somehow, as if the very walls had shifted while I sat listening to his measured words. In the days that followed, I moved through the academy like someone learning to see for the first time. Every detail that had seemed ordinary before now carried potential significance. The way certain students clustered in the dining hall, their conversations dying when others approached. The particular routes the keepers took through the corridors, always avoiding the same sections of the East Wing. During my supervised sessions in the Archivum, I watched everything with new intensity. Mrs. Kettle handled most texts with her usual brisk efficiency, but certain volumes received different treatment. These she wrapped in silk before placing them in specially marked cases, her movements careful and reverent.
"That's quite old,"
she said when she caught me staring at a leather-bound tome she was securing with unusual care.
"The binding's fragile."
But I had seen her handle manuscripts far older with nothing more than cotton gloves. This was something else. The keepers moved through the stacks on practiced routes that seemed designed to avoid particular sections entirely. When I tried to follow one toward the restricted area, he turned abruptly and headed back, as if he'd remembered an urgent task elsewhere. "Excuse me," I called. "I was wondering about the classification system for—"
"You'll need to speak with Mrs. Kettle about that," he said without stopping. "I'm just here to dust the shelves."
Yet moments before, I had seen him consulting catalog cards, his finger tracing entries like someone who knew exactly what he was looking for. The corridors outside the keeper offices had their own mysteries. Conversation stopped mid-sentence when I approached, voices dropping to whispers or falling silent entirely. I began timing my walks, noting which doors remained closed and which stood ajar, cataloging the subtle signs that suggested the academy's real business happened in spaces students weren't meant to see. "Miss Blackwell," Professor Aldrich called one afternoon as I passed his partially open door. "A moment, if you please." I paused, my pulse quickening. Through the gap, I could see him seated at his desk with another man I didn't recognize, older, silver-haired, and dressed in clothes that suggested authority beyond the academy's walls. A dispatch case lay on the table between them, stamped with the council's sealed sigil and a smaller quorum mark I knew from notices in the rector's hall. Seeing it made my throat go dry. "Actually," Aldrich said after a brief pause, "perhaps later would be better. I'll send word when I'm free, counselor." The door closed with a soft click, but not before I caught a fragment of their conversation. "The girl shows promise, but we'll need to be certain of her discretion before—" I walked on, my heart hammering. The girl. They were discussing me. That night I was drawn to the corridors outside the student quarters. Most of my fellow students had retired hours ago, but the academy wasn't truly quiet. Footsteps echoed from distant hallways, doors opened and closed in sections that should have been empty, and occasionally I heard voices, too low to make out words, but carrying the urgency of people conducting business that couldn't wait for daylight. I tried several doors that should have led to storage rooms or unused classrooms. All were locked. The brass handles turned smoothly but stopped short, as if secured from the inside. Behind one, I thought I heard the scratch of pen on paper, but when I pressed my ear to the wood, the sound stopped. "Can't sleep either?" I spun to find Celine standing at the far end of the corridor, her nightgown making her look like a ghost in the dim light. "I was just," I began. "Looking for answers?" She came closer, her bare feet silent on the stone. "I do the same. Walk the halls at night, trying to piece together what they don't want us to see." "Have you found anything?" She was quiet for a long moment, studying my face in the shadows.
Depends on what you mean by finding. I've learned that some doors are locked for reasons that have nothing to do with storage, and that the Academy keeps different hours than the ones printed in the handbook.
As if to prove her point, footsteps echoed from the floor above, measured, deliberate, the sound of someone who knew exactly where they were going.
They're always moving at night, Celine whispered. Papers, books, sometimes people. I've seen keepers carrying things wrapped in cloth, heading towards parts of the building I didn't even know existed.
What kind of things?
I don't know.
She hesitated, searching for the right words as if the truth tasted strange.
Things that matter enough to hide. Things that change what you think this place is.
She glanced toward the locked doors.
Important enough to keep away from students who ask too many questions.
The footsteps above had stopped, but I could feel activity continuing somewhere beyond our sight. The Academy had revealed itself as something far more complex than a simple school, its true nature hidden beneath layers of routine and regulation, meant to keep students like us from seeing too much.
Celine,
I said quietly, what do you know about the orders Professor Aldrich mentioned, the different groups operating within the Academy? Her expression shifted, becoming guarded. For a long moment she seemed to weigh whether to speak at all. When she finally answered, her voice was thin and careful, like someone pulling a thread that might unravel a whole tapestry.
There are lines drawn in this place, lines you don't cross unless you mean to be changed by it.
She looked at me directly, and the glow of the corridor made her eyes sharp.
They're not just clubs or committees. They're promises, and sometimes they're bargains. You don't step into them expecting to come back the same.
Is that what Aldrich wants? To bind me to one of them? She breathed a small, humorous laugh.
He wants you useful and quiet, useful in ways that won't be visible at the dinner table.
She stepped closer, lowering her voice until it was almost a secret between us.
Be careful what you call an opportunity, Adeline. Some doors are tests that lock you in.
Redacted Winter. 2 weeks had passed since my meeting with Aldrich, and the supervised cataloging sessions had become a routine I both dreaded and craved. Each afternoon brought me deeper into the archivum's restricted sections, where I sorted documents under the watchful eyes of keepers who never quite trusted me with anything truly dangerous. I emerged from another session that afternoon, my fingers still stained with the peculiar ink that resisted washing. The commons near the archivum entrance buzzed with its usual activity. Students hunched over research tables, the soft scratch of quills against parchment, the occasional whispered consultation between scholars. The autumn light filtering through the tall windows had grown thin, casting everything in muted grays. Adeline. I turned to find Nathaniel approaching, that familiar smile playing at the corners of his mouth. He moved with the easy confidence I'd noticed before, but something about his posture suggested a purpose. A leather portfolio was tucked under his arm, worn at the edges and secured with a brass clasp that caught the weak afternoon light. Nathaniel, I shifted my satchel to my other shoulder, suddenly aware of how tired I must look. Finished with your own research? For now. He glanced around the commons, taking in the scattered groups of students and the keepers who moved between the tables like watchful sentinels. Actually, I was hoping we might continue our conversation from the other week about mutual interests. The way he said it made something tighten in my chest. Not fear, exactly, but recognition, the same careful tone Aldrich used when he wanted something. What kind of conversation? The kind that requires privacy. His smile widened, but his eyes remained serious. I've come across some materials that might interest someone with your access privileges. Perhaps we could find somewhere quieter to discuss them? I hesitated. The Commons felt safe in its openness, surrounded by witnesses and the steady presence of authority. But curiosity had always been my weakness, and the way he held that portfolio suggested secrets worth knowing. "There's an alcove near the philosophy section," I said finally. "It's usually empty this time of day." "Perfect." He gestured for me to lead the way, and I walked deeper into the library's maze of shelves and study nooks. The philosophy section occupied a forgotten corner where dust motes danced in shafts of dying sunlight, and the alcove I'd mentioned sat behind a collection of treatises on moral philosophy that no one had disturbed in months. We settled onto the worn wooden bench that curved along the alcove's back wall. Nathaniel set the portfolio between us and worked the brass clasp with practiced fingers. "Before I show you this," he said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, "I need to know how much has Aldrich already shared with you about the real work of the Archivum?" "Enough to know there are things I'm not supposed to see." I watched his hands pause on the clasp. "Why?" "Because what I'm about to show you came from sources he'd prefer remained undisturbed." The clasp opened with a soft click. "And because I suspect you've already seen enough to understand why that matters." He lifted the top sheet, revealing dense marginalia that crawled along the borders like living things. The symbols seemed to writhe under my gaze, rearranging themselves into patterns that hurt to follow. The right question is what they mean. I leaned closer despite myself. The annotations were in multiple hands, some in languages I recognized and others in scripts that bent the rules of written communication entirely. Numbers and diagrams wove between the text, forming a secondary narrative of its own strange logic. "I can't read most of this," I admitted. "Nor could I at first," he said, softer now, almost confiding, "but I've been piecing it together, cross-referencing scraps, drawing conclusions. It's not a map of rooms or routes. It's a map of duties and favors, who owes whom, and how those debts carry weight through time." "Debts?" The word felt small against the paper's heavy presence. "The families who built the Archivum, those who still pull strings." He turned the page, revealing a diagram like a family tree twisted into impossible geometry. "Your name is here, so is mine. Every student granted special access, every privileged appointment, lined up like entries in a ledger." My throat tightened. "That's impossible." "Is it?" He leaned back, studying me as if measuring how far to press. "How many students get invited into Aldrich's circle? How many opportunities are handed out? Tests, recommendations, quiet favors?" I thought of the documents I'd been cataloging, the keeper's careful gazes, Aldrich's pointed questions that felt like probes. "What are you proposing?" "We combine what we know." He tapped the spread of pages between us. "You can reach places I can't. I have sources you haven't seen. Together we might actually see the pattern." "And if we don't like what we find?" His smile went thin, almost predatory. "Then at least we'll know who benefits and who stands to lose." Silence pooled in the alcove, heavy as the dust. Outside, the library hummed on, but here, surrounded by forbidden pages and the soft threat of discovery, curiosity clashed with the caution Celine had lectured me about. "What do you need from me?" I asked, finally. "Every scrap Aldrich's shared, every document, every offhand remark, everything." He watched me steadily. "And one more thing. Your sister." The name landed like a stone. What about her? She's listed. He touched a corner where a faded name sat among cryptic annotations. Elena Blackwell, under unresolved assets. My breath caught. The word asset made her into something cold and ledgered, like everything else in this place. I stared at Elena's name until the letters blurred. The marginalia around it formed geometric patterns that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking. Triangular forms connected by thin lines, creating a web that stretched across the page. Some symbols pulsed with their own internal logic, as if they were alive. These patterns, I said, tracing one with my finger, they're not in any curriculum I've seen. Nathaniel leaned closer, his shoulder brushing mine. No, they wouldn't be. Look. He pointed to a cluster of symbols surrounding a name I didn't recognize. These remind me of annotations I've come across. Not standard notation. Could be a contractual mark, though the medium isn't obvious. He squinted at cramped text written in what looked like Latin, but with characters I couldn't identify. Multiple tongues. Some I know, others... He let the thought fall. The Academy keeps a lot under wraps. What does it mean, the contractual part? Think of it as a note that someone owes something or promised something, he said, tapping another section. But I can't be certain what kind of promise. His finger moved to where the geometric forms intersected. See how the names cross-reference? Like an internal index, names tied to entries, cross-checked across folios. Not whispered conspiracies, more like a network of records. I turned the page carefully. More names, more patterns. The forms grew more complex, creating intricate webs that seemed to pulse with meaning I couldn't grasp. And Elena's listed under unresolved assets because she left before matters were settled. He lowered his voice. Tell me about your archival work. What exactly has Aldrich been showing you? The question felt pointed. I glanced at him, noting how his casual pose didn't match the intensity in his eyes. Why do you want to know? Because you have access I don't. The restricted materials, the private sessions. Aldrich doesn't give those to just anyone. He gestured at the folio between us. This is one of many pieces. You've seen others, haven't you? I had. Documents that made no sense, ledgers with names and numbers, correspondence in languages I couldn't read, but something in his tone made me hesitate. Some things, nothing that explained much. What sort of things? Financial records, lists of names, letters. I watched his reaction carefully. Why are you so interested in what Aldrich shows me specifically? Because he's picky about who sees the real archives. Most students get scrubbed copies, edited, softened, with the important parts removed. He turned another page, revealing more marginalia. But you're looking at originals. That tells me he thinks you can handle it. Handle it for what? To understand. To step into a vacancy. He looked at me directly. To stand where someone else once stood. The words hit like cold water. Stand where? Think, Adeline. Why bring you here, give you special access, show you things others don't? You're not only Elena's sister, you were placed where someone else used to be. I stared at the folio, at Elena's name surrounded by those pulsing geometric forms. The annotations Nathaniel had mentioned seemed to writhe on the page, connecting her to other names, other entries. What happened to the others? The ones listed here? Some graduated, some didn't. He remained neutral, almost clinical. Some vanished like Elena, and some stuck around and later slid into posts, faculty, administration, other positions of influence. He let the implication hang. A single folio doesn't tell the whole story. Like faculty positions or administrative? Both, probably. The records thread through offices and orders, but I won't pretend I can map the whole thing from this alone." He closed the folio with care. "So, what are you going to do with what you know?" I looked around the alcove, at the dusty shelves and afternoon light filtering through tall windows. Everything seemed normal, peaceful even. But underneath that normalcy, I could feel something else, a current of purpose that had been guiding me since the moment I'd arrived at Blackwood. I need to understand what happened to Elena, what's still happening to others like her. Then we worked together. His smile was sharp, conspiratorial. "You bring me everything Aldrich shares, every document, every casual comment, every private session. I'll help you untangle it." Warnings rattled in my head. Celine's cautions about trust, the careful way he'd approached me, his too convenient knowledge of the symbols. But the hunger for answers was harder to ignore than suspicion. I nodded. "What about the risks?" "There are always risks." He slid the folio back into his portfolio. "But ignorance is worse. Ask Celine. She'll tell you what happens to students who don't learn the rules." The mention of Celine made me pause. "You know about her visions?" "I know she sees what others don't, and I know she's protective of you." He stood and slung his portfolio over his shoulder. "But protection without understanding is just delayed ruin. You won't avoid harm by staying blind." I stayed seated, weighing everything we'd discussed. The geometric patterns from the folio seemed burned into my vision, connecting Elena to a web of names and entries I was only beginning to glimpse. "When do we start?" "We already have." He paused at the edge of the alcove. "Next time Aldrich calls you in, take note of everything, every slip of phrase, every document, every hesitance. Nothing is too small." As his footsteps faded into the general hum of the library, I sat alone with the weight of what I'd agreed to. The afternoon light had shifted, casting longer shadows between the shelves. Somewhere in those shadows, I could almost see the geometric forms from the marginalia, still pulsing with their hidden logic, binding me to a pattern I was only beginning to understand. The afternoon dissolved into memory, leaving only the echo of promises made in shadow. A week passed in careful observation, each day measured by the weight of secrets I carried, and the growing certainty that I was being watched in return. Early morning light filtered through the tall windows of the East Wing corridor, casting rectangles across the floor. I had come early to the Archivum, hoping to catch Mira before the day's supervised sessions began, but raised voices stopped me short of the entrance.
"Step back, Whitmore."
Keeper Edwin Aldrich's voice cut through the morning quiet. He was one of the senior keepers who supervised routine dormitory inspections and the security of restricted stacks, no relation to Professor Thaddeus Aldrich, whose name often set other sorts of hearts racing. "Hands where we can see them." I pressed into the shadowed alcove between two pillars, heart hammering as I peered around the edge. Marcus Whitmore, a second year in philology, known for his meticulous notes and long afternoons in the far reading corner, had the talent of vanishing into texts and little else. 3 keepers formed a tight circle around him. His face had gone white. His hands trembled as he held them up in surrender.
I don't understand,"
he said, cracking.
"What's this about?"
Keeper Aldrich held up a sheaf of papers, the edges with age.
"These were found in your dormitory room during a routine inspection. Care to explain?"
Even from my hiding place, I could see the cramped handwriting covering the pages, symbols sketched in the margins that made my stomach clench with recognition. Marcus's eyes darted frantically between the keepers' faces.
I've never seen those before. Someone must have...
"Someone must have what?" Aldrich's tone remained level, almost bored. "Planted restricted materials in your things? That's a serious claim, Mr. Whitmore."
I'm telling you, they're not mine."
A 4th figure stepped into view, and my breath caught. Nathaniel moved with careful precision, positioning himself just close enough to appear concerned, but far enough to avoid suspicion. His expression was perfectly calibrated, worried, civic-minded, reluctant to speak. "Keeper Aldrich," Nathaniel said, warm and measured, "I don't want to cause trouble, but—" Marcus's head snapped toward him.
"Nathaniel, what are you doing?"
"I've been uneasy about Marcus lately," Nathaniel continued, not meeting Marcus's eyes. "He keeps asking about old disappearances, about who is allowed to see the restricted shelves. I thought I was imagining it, but then I caught him copying strange symbols from a book that belongs in the restricted collection."
"You bastard!" The words tore from Marcus's throat. "You absolute bastard!"
Aldrich raised a hand for silence. "What specific behaviors did you observe, Mr. Crownhurst?" Nathaniel's shoulders sagged, as if the weight of testimony pained him. He softened in that practiced way that made his honesty sound like a sacrifice. "He asked too many pointed questions in study group. He was there when I saw the restricted tome last week. I thought I should tell someone."
"That's not—"
Marcus lunged, but two keepers caught his arms.
"Nathaniel, tell them the truth! You know I would never!"
"I'm sorry, Marcus," Nathaniel said, small and contrite. "I should have said something sooner." The precision of it was breathtaking. Every word calculated, every gesture rehearsed. I watched Nathaniel's performance with a mixture of admiration and revulsion, recognizing the careful orchestration of Marcus's downfall, the illicit notes, the convenient inspection by the keepers who conducted dorm checks, the perfectly timed testimony. None of it was coincidence. "Mr. Whitmore," Aldrich said, folding the papers with deliberate care, "you'll come with us for questioning. The Disciplinary Council of Fellows will review your case."
"Please,"
Marcus whispered.
"I have a sister at home. My family depends on my scholarship."
The keepers moved, Marcus between them like a prisoner. His legs barely held him as they guided him toward the main corridor. As they passed Nathaniel, he turned his head, and I saw the naked betrayal in his eyes.
"I trusted you,"
he said, barely audible. Nathaniel's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. The procession disappeared around the corner, their footsteps echoing off the walls until silence returned to the corridor. Nathaniel remained near the Archivum entrance, staring at the spot where Marcus had been. For a moment, his carefully composed mask slipped, revealing something that might have been regret. Then he straightened his shoulders and walked away, leaving me alone in the shadows with the bitter taste of understanding. I had witnessed the elimination of a competitor, executed with surgical precision. Marcus Whitmore had been researching the same restricted matters that consumed Nathaniel and me, and for that crime he had been removed from the game entirely. The morning light seemed colder now, and I wondered how many other students had asked the wrong questions, lingered too long near restricted materials, or simply stood in the way of someone else's ambitions. The Academy's lessons were becoming clearer with each passing day, written not in textbooks, but in the careful choreography of betrayal. The keepers' voices faded down the corridor, but their approval lingered in the air like incense. I remained in the shadows, watching as Nathaniel emerged from the aftermath of Marcus's removal with the careful composure of someone who had just performed a civic duty. "Nathaniel," Keeper Aldrich's voice carried the weight of institutional gratitude, "your vigilance serves the Academy well." "I only did what any concerned student would do." His response was pitched perfectly, humble enough to deflect suspicion, confident enough to claim credit. When I noticed Marcus spending unusual hours near restricted sections, asking questions about materials beyond his clearance level, he let the sentence hang, allowing the keepers to fill in the implications. I watched him shift his weight slightly, hands behind his back in a posture of respectful attention. "The Academy's security depends on students like you," another keeper added, "those willing to speak up when they observe concerning behavior." "It wasn't easy," he said, the cadence deliberate, as if choosing each word for its public face. "Marcus was personable,
But then I found these notes, symbols I couldn't ignore." He shook his head in a small, practiced way. "I had to report it." The keepers murmured their approval, and I felt my stomach turn. The performance was flawless, a concerned peer who had wrestled with his conscience before doing the right thing. But I had seen the calculation in his eyes during Marcus's removal, the satisfaction barely concealed beneath his mask of civic responsibility. "Your actions demonstrate the kind of moral character we hope to instill in all our students," Keeper Aldrich said. "The academy is safer because of your courage." As the keepers moved away, other students began to approach. Word of his role in Marcus's exposure had spread quickly through the morning corridors, and I watched him navigate the resulting conversations with surgical precision.
"I heard you're the one who reported Marcus," whispered Elena Hartwell.
Elena, the name everyone remembered from last term's unsettled roster, now returned after a period away and quietly restored to active standing. A third year whose family connections made her worth cultivating. "I wouldn't put it like that," he said, smiling just enough to make it seem modest. "I shared what I saw when asked. The keepers decided the rest."
"Still, it must have been difficult. You two seemed friendly."
"That's precisely why it hit me so hard." He leaned in, lowering his voice into a confidential thread. "When someone you trust starts acting off, you have to reassess everything. It's unnerving." Elena nodded, already buying the shape of his story. Within minutes, she would be telling others about his difficult but necessary choice, spreading his version of events through the student body like ripples in a pond. When Thomas Brennan, a second-year scholarship student with little family influence and a reputation for blunt questions, approached with straightforward queries, Nathaniel tightened into polite distance. He answered Thomas's questions with short, unruffled sentences before moving on to someone who might be more useful.
"Nathaniel?"
Professor Whitmore, senior fellow of hermeneutics, who taught semiotics and carried himself with the reserved gravity of one used to council chambers, had appeared at his elbow.
"Nathaniel?"
No relation to Marcus, despite the shared name.
"I understand you played a role in this morning's incident."
"I reported what I observed, Professor. That's all." His voice was calm, impeccably modest.
"Of course. Still, it shows admirable judgment. The Academy values students who understand their responsibilities to the community."
He accepted the praise with an easy bow of his head, but his eyes were already tracking the next cluster of students, always calculating. Each interaction reinforced the same pattern, a measured posture, words tuned to flatter or to reassure, presence displayed when it served him. When Margaret Ashford, Celine's roommate, a cautious second year in philology who had been probing the implications of tighter watch, tried to engage him about broader consequences, he sidestepped with practiced care. "The keepers know what they're doing. We should focus on our studies and trust their judgment," he said, the line designed to close the conversation and sound prudent. But when Keeper Morrison, a junior keeper assigned to corridor rounds and discipline, passed by moments later, he straightened and made sure his little group was visible. He positioned himself so the keeper could see him offering explanations and calm leadership. The responsible student helping peers understand the morning's events. The pattern became unmistakable as I continued watching. Every word, every gesture, every choice of whom to engage and whom to dismiss revealed a mind that viewed the Academy's social landscape as a chessboard. Relationships weren't connections between human beings. They were assets to be cultivated or liabilities to be discarded based on their utility to his ambitions. I thought of Marcus, led away in shock and betrayal, his research destroyed and his reputation ruined. How long had Nathaniel been watching him, cataloging his movements, waiting for the perfect moment to strike? How many others had he evaluated and found wanting, marked for elimination when the opportunity arose? The morning sun slanted through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the corridor where he continued his careful performance. but beneath his helpful facade, I could see the ambition burning like a cold flame, consuming everything in its path with methodical precision. The morning dissolved into routine, but something had shifted in the academy's careful order. I felt it first during roll call, when Matron Hester's voice carried across the dining hall with its usual measured authority. "Whitmore Marcus?" A pause. "Under review." "Ashcroft Celine?" Another pause.
"Present."
The names continued in alphabetical order, each followed by the expected response. Students straightened in their chairs, voices clear and prompt. This daily ritual had become as natural as breathing, a confirmation that we were all accounted for, all where we belonged. "Pike, Rowan?" Silence. Hester waited, pen poised above the register. The quiet stretched longer than usual, and I looked toward the empty chair where Rowan typically sat. His absence felt like a missing tooth, obvious once noticed. "Pike, Rowan?" she repeated, carrying no irritation, only professional patience. Still, nothing. A third time. "Pike, Rowan?" The silence that followed was different now, charged with awareness. Students began glancing around, confirming what we all suspected. Hester made a small mark in her register, the scratch of her pen audible in the stillness. "Absent," she noted, then continued down the list without pause. But the damage was done. Rowan's empty chair had become the center of attention, and by the time we moved to breakfast, whispered conversations had already begun. I took my usual seat at one of the long tables, watching as students leaned toward each other with the careful urgency of shared secrets. The dining hall buzzed with subdued energy, forks clinking against plates while voices stayed deliberately low. "Did anyone see him last night?" Sarah Whitlock, a first year with a habit of collecting hallway rumors, whispered to the girl beside her. "His bed was made this morning," someone else added. "I saw it when I passed his room." Matron Hester moved between the tables with practiced ease, checking on students, ensuring proper behavior. When she reached our section, Thomas Hartwell, a meticulous second year in philology, known for formal manners, looked up from his porridge.
"Matron, is Rowan unwell? He missed roll call."
Her expression remained perfectly neutral. The careful composure that came from years of managing institutional concerns. "Mr. Pike's bed was found made this morning, his belongings in perfect order. Perhaps he rose early for private study." The explanation sounded reasonable, even plausible. Students often sought quiet corners for extra reading, especially those struggling with their coursework. But something in Hester's tone suggested she'd given this same answer before.
"Will he return for morning lectures?"
another student asked.
"I'm certain Mr. Pike is managing his studies appropriately," she replied with gentle finality that discouraged further questions. "Please focus on your breakfast." She moved on, but I caught the way her shoulders held themselves a fraction too straight, the slight tension that made her calm seem performance rather than reality. When Margaret Thornfield, a senior who helps Hester manage morning order, approached the serving area, I strained to hear their quiet exchange.
"His things were all there?" Margaret asked, keeping her words low. "Books in their places, linens folded, brushes hung," Hester said, softer now, but still practical, cataloging facts to reassure herself as much as anyone. "He's always kept his room neat." "But to miss roll call entirely," Margaret whispered, threaded with worry. "Some students prefer solitary study," Hester answered, smoothing a napkin with small, exacting motions. "Especially around assessments. Mr. Pike can be withdrawn at times." The word she chose, withdrawn, felt like a careful step away from admitting worry. It was functional, meant to close the door rather than open it. "Should we be concerned?" Margaret pressed gently. "The Academy has protocols for absences," Hester replied with maternal steadiness. "If Mr. Pike is absent without notice, the housemaster will follow up. For now, keep to routine and let the proper steps take their course." But even as she spoke, I could see the slight tightness around her eyes and the way her hands straightened items on the serving table. Whatever had happened to Rowan, Hester knew more than she was saying. The breakfast crowd dispersed with its usual morning shuffle, but I lingered near the serving tables, watching Hester clear away the remnants of our meal. Her efficiency couldn't quite mask the tension I'd noticed, and when the last student filed out, I approached her. "Matron Hester," I said, keeping my voice low, "about Rowan. Has this happened before?" She paused, a stack of plates balanced in her hands. "Students sometimes oversleep, Miss Blackwell, or lose track of time in their studies." "But not Rowan." I stepped closer. "He's never missed roll call, has he?" Her silence stretched long enough to become an answer. She set down the plates and looked at me directly. "No, he hasn't." "Then something's wrong." "Something's always wrong somewhere in this place," she said, but her voice carried weariness, deeper than morning fatigue. "The question is whether we're meant to notice it." That afternoon, I went to the administrative wing. The corridors here felt different from the rest of the academy. Quieter, more watchful. Portraits of former headmasters gazed down from gilt frames, their painted eyes following my progress with disapproval. The records office sat behind a heavy oak door marked with brass lettering. Inside, filing cabinets lined the walls like sentries, and a single clerk hunched over a ledger at a narrow desk. He looked up as I entered, his pale eyes magnified behind thick spectacles. "Good afternoon," I said. "I'm looking to review student movement records." He blinked and pushed his spectacles up. "You'll need clearance." "I have permission from Professor Aldrich." The lie came easily. Aldrich's name carried weight here, and the clerk's expression shifted from suspicion to grudging cooperation. He gestured toward a cabinet in the corner.
"I'm Ellis Perwin, Archivum Records Clerk, assigned to student movements,"
he added as if to supply formality.
"Movement ledgers are in the third drawer. Sign the access log."
Not Mott, the keeper who handled sealed dispatches, but Perwin, who kept the daybooks. I scrawled my name and pulled out the thick volume marked with the current month. The pages crackled as I opened it, revealing neat columns of names, times, and destinations. I flipped to the entries for the past week, scanning for Rowan's name. There, Tuesday evening, signed out for library research. Wednesday, the same. Thursday showed his signature again, but something was wrong. The entry looked different, the ink slightly darker, the handwriting just off enough to catch my attention. I turned the page, looking for Friday's entries, but found only a ragged edge where the paper had been torn away. Not cut cleanly, but ripped out of haste. "Excuse me," I called to Perwin. "Some pages are missing from this ledger." He rose from his desk and shuffled over, peering at the damaged binding.
"Missing?"
"Friday through Sunday. They've been torn out." He frowned, the polite line around his mouth tightening.
"How strange. I'll have to report this to the administrator."
"When did you last check this ledger?"
"Monday morning, during the weekly review." He hesitated. "The pages were intact then."
Someone had removed them in the past 2 days. Someone who knew Rowan was gone and wanted to erase any record of where he might have been. I spent the next hour combing through the other records, disciplinary files, academic standings, dormitory assignments. Each search revealed the same pattern of careful omissions. Rowan Pike existed in the Academy's documentation, but only as a shadow. His recent activities were systematically erased. The following morning brought new restrictions. A notice appeared on the dormitory bulletin board, signed by the head of student affairs. Effective immediately, corridor access between dormitory wings will be limited to designated hours. Students found in unauthorized areas after evening meal will face disciplinary review. Margaret Ashford read the notice aloud during breakfast, her voice tight with concern. "They've never restricted corridor access before," she said.
"It's for our safety,"
said one of the younger girls, but she didn't sound convinced. I caught Celine's eye across the table. She gave an almost imperceptible shake of her head. A warning. Whatever was happening, the academy was closing ranks, making investigation more difficult. That evening, I tested the new restrictions. A keeper stationed at the junction between the east and west wings turned me back when I tried to pass. "Evening meal ended an hour ago, Miss Blackwell. Return to your quarters." "I left a book in the library." "It'll be there tomorrow." His tone brooked no argument, and I noticed how his hand rested on the whistle at his belt. They were taking these restrictions seriously. I tried a different route the next night, using a service corridor I'd discovered weeks earlier. This time I made it halfway to the administrative wing before encountering another keeper, less polite than the first. "This is your second attempt to violate corridor restrictions," he said, consulting a small notebook. "One more violation means a disciplinary hearing." They were tracking my movements, documenting my attempts to investigate. The net was tightening around anyone who showed too much curiosity about Rowan's disappearance. As I walked back to my dormitory, a realization made my pulse quicken. The pattern was too familiar, too precise. I'd seen this before. The missing documentation, the contradictory statements from staff, the sudden implementation of new restrictions designed to prevent investigation. This was exactly what had happened when my sister disappeared. The same careful erasure of inconvenient details, the same official obfuscation wrapped in concern for student welfare. The same way questions were deflected and curiosity discouraged until everyone stopped asking where she'd gone. I lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling while my roommate slept. Somewhere in this academy, there were answers about what had happened to both Rowan and my sister. The keepers could implement all the restrictions they wanted, change protocols, station guards at every corridor junction. It would only make me more determined to find the truth. The next morning brought a different kind of determination. I rose before dawn, dressed quietly, and made my way through the empty corridors toward the archivum. The keepers had implemented their new restrictions, but they hadn't yet learned to account for someone who understood their schedules better than they realized. Mira looked up from her desk as I entered, her expression unreadable in the morning light filtering through the high windows. "You're early." I couldn't sleep. I approached her desk, noting the stack of requisition forms beneath her hand. "I've been thinking about what you said, about expanded access." She studied my face for a long moment. "And?" "I want to know what happened to my sister. What really happened." The words came out steadier than I felt. Not the official version, not the careful explanations. The truth. Her hand went to the small brass token pinned to her ledger, an audit seal the council issued for supervised reviews. She touched it once, almost mechanically. "There are sanctioned channels for this, Miss Blackwell. I have clearance for an inventory audit today. It will let you consult restricted materials under supervision." "I'm prepared to try." She pushed a signed slip across the desk. The council's embossed mark glinted faintly. "Then we'll proceed within the remit. I can show you redacted copies and secondary transcripts, items the archive keeps for reviewed consultation. Full originals remain sealed unless the council authorizes release. Understand that what you see will be incomplete." "I understand." I let my fingers hover over the slip before taking it. She rose, assuming a professional posture, Very well, but remember, these records are curated for reasons. You must draw connections. You may form theories. I cannot confirm every inference for you. I followed her deeper into the archivum than I'd ever been before, past the cataloging chambers where I'd spent so many supervised hours. The corridors here were narrower, the air thick with the institutional smell of old paper and the mineral tang of iron fittings. "The restricted storage areas," she said as we walked. "You are an authorized consult. It's not a secret breaking. It's procedure. The lock will record my access." When she fitted a key into the door, she dipped it into a small ink pad and impressed a mark on a ledger at her hip. The same motion as any keeper's entry. "Signature and timestamp," she said. "Everything accounted for." Inside, rows of filing cabinets stretched into shadows. Each drawer labeled with dates spanning decades. Some labels had been partially obscured, others completely removed. "Where do I start?" I asked. "With questions." She pulled out a drawer marked with a date from 15 years ago. "What do you want to know about your sister's disappearance?" "Everything. The incident reports, the transfer logs." She lifted a thick folder, its edges worn from handling. "We have reviewed copies here. Some are fully redacted. Others are marginal transcripts. Start with these and see what you can piece together." I opened the folder on a nearby reading table. The first document was an Academy incident report, but as I read, my stomach sank. Entire paragraphs had been blacked out with thick ink. Names had been redacted. Dates were missing or partially obscured. "This is useless," I said. "Half of it's been censored." "Keep reading." Her voice remained even. I turned the page. Another report, this one about a student named Thomas Harrow, who had disappeared 3 years before my sister. The same pattern. Crucial details blacked out, key information removed. But in the margins, someone had written notes in pencil, small cramped handwriting that was barely legible. "Who wrote these?" I asked. "Previous researchers, students and junior keepers who asked the same questions you're asking now." Her words were careful. "Some left notes for those who followed. A handful managed to piece things together from cross-references." "And the others?" She pulled out another drawer, labeled for protocols and marked as reviewed copies. "These are the inventoried transcripts from experimental records." The protocols were worse. Entire sections had been excised from the review copies. Bands and adhesive stubs where text had once been. What remained described cognitive restructuring procedures and memory stabilization protocols, but without context, the fragments made no coherent sense. "What were they doing?" I asked. "Experiments, broadly speaking." She shifted a stack aside. "The Academy has long pursued the boundaries of mind and memory. The inventory uses cautious language, procedural irregularities, stabilization measures, because the originals are sealed or destroyed. The copies here are what auditors permitted for consultation." She handed me a transfer log, its binding cracked with age. I opened it to find pages of student names, dates, and destinations. But as I read, the entries grew stranger. Students transferred to wards and holdings whose names no longer appear on any map. Dates that made little sense in sequence. Then, halfway through the log, the handwriting changed completely. "This isn't the same person," I said, comparing the script. "No." She inclined her head. "The original recorder left. A successor continued the register. The audit copies show where continuity broke. The inconsistency is why some entries were later sealed." I spent the next several hours moving between documents, trying to piece together a coherent picture. But the more I read, the more fragmented everything became. Reports referenced other reports that had been removed. Protocols mentioned procedures that were never described in the transcripts. Transfer logs stopped mid-sentence and resumed with different information entirely. "It's deliberate," I said finally, looking up from a particularly mangled incident report. "Someone has systematically destroyed or altered these records." Multiple hands over many administrations. She folded a page and replaced it gently. Each generation of keepers and administrators judged certain material unfit for general circulation. Their language framed those decisions as necessary containment, risk mitigation. But here, in the audit copies, you'll mostly see the conclusions translated into bureaucratic terms. To cover up what they've done, or to limit what is allowed to be discussed in public records. She paused, careful. There were incidents, catalogued as irregularities, as cohort losses, as procedural failures, spanning decades. One in particular, about 20 years past, reshaped policy and tightened controls. The audit copies refer to it obliquely. The originals are under seal. I stared at the documents spread across the table. Decades of omissions, strategic redactions, and bureaucratic phrasing designed to obscure rather than illuminate. The same language had been used in the explanations of my sister's disappearance. The same careful non-answers Matron Hester had parroted. Protocol preserved, investigations closed. "They're still doing it," I said. "Whatever happened 20 years ago, the system never stopped." "Possibly." She replaced a folder and set it aside with the rest. Or perhaps the systems those events produced are what persists. The regulations, the seals, the custodial practices designed to prevent reoccurrence. My point is procedural. Be precise about what you ask for and how you interpret these copies. The archive will not hand you a neat truth. I thought about Rowan's disappearance, about the missing pages in the movement ledger and the contradictory keeper statements. The pattern repeated itself in the faded margins and the tape stubs. "I'm going to find out what really happened," I said, "to all of them." Her smile was clinical. "If you're determined, you'll need broader access over time, permission to view originals, petitions to the council, corroborating testimony. For now, you've seen the audit copies. I can log further consults for you, but each will follow procedure. No surprises, no unvouchsafed removals." She stood and moved to a cabinet I hadn't noticed before, one secured with additional seals and an attached council docket. She tapped the docket and ran a quick motion through the ledger at her hip. "I've recorded our session. Your consult is authorized. The record will show my signature and the timestamp. That's the cover you asked for and the limit I can provide." As she returned documents to their proper places, I realized that everything I thought I knew about the Academy had been built on carefully constructed language and selective preservation. The truth lay here, in fragments and footnotes, but it would take more than access slips to uncover it. It would take petitions, time, and a steady trail of corroboration. 2 weeks passed before I saw Mira Kettle again, and when I did, something had changed. The winter air had settled into the Academy's bones, making the archivum feel even more tomb-like than usual. I found her in the banned volume section, moving between the tall stacks with an agitation I'd never seen before. Her usual measured pace had become erratic. She paused at shelves, touched spines without purpose, then moved on as if she'd forgotten what she was looking for. When she noticed me watching from the entrance to her private office area, her shoulders tensed. "Miss Blackwell!" Her voice carried the same professional courtesy, but underneath it ran something raw. "I wasn't expecting you today." "I need to ask you about some records," I said, stepping closer. "About students who've gone missing." Her hand stilled on a leather-bound volume. "Missing is a strong word." "Rowan Pike disappeared 2 weeks ago. His bed was made, his belongings untouched, but he's gone, just like my sister was gone." I watched her face carefully. "Just like others have been gone." Her composed facade cracked for a moment, a flash of guilt and fear she couldn't quite suppress. Her fingers tightened on the book's spine. "I catalog what I'm given to catalog," she said, but the words lacked their usual conviction. "The records I've seen are incomplete. Pages torn out, sections redacted, entire incidents reduced to bureaucratic fragments." I moved closer, lowering my voice. "You know what happened to them." She turned away and walked deeper into the stacks. "I know my duties." "Your duties to whom? The academy, or to the students who trusted you?" That stopped her. She stood with her back to me, one hand pressed against a shelf as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. "You don't understand the position I'm in," she whispered. "Then help me understand." She shook her head, still not turning. "I can't. I won't risk—" She cut herself off, but the implication hung in the air between us. She went to the filing cabinet, opened it, rifled through some papers, then closed it again without taking anything. But she didn't lock it. "I have work to do," she said, passing me toward another section. I stayed where I was, staring at the unlocked cabinet. When I looked up, she was at a reading table, sorting through a stack of documents. As I watched, she set one file slightly apart, then seemed to reconsider and push it back, but not quite to its original position. "The winter makes everything more difficult," she said without looking at me. "Files get misfiled. Cabinets sometimes don't get locked properly. Accidents happen." Her words were careful, measured, but loaded with meaning. "Accidents," I repeated. "Yes," she finally met my eyes. "Terrible accidents. The kind that happen to bright students who ask too many questions." Her voice broke on the last words. "The kind I've watched happen before." She returned to her documents, but her hands trembled now. "I've been here 15 years, Miss Blackwell. 15 years of watching promising young minds disappear into the Academy's machinery. And every time I told myself there was nothing I could do, that speaking out would only make things worse. But now I'm done being a quiet cog." She rose abruptly, opened another cabinet, removed a single folder, then slid it into the wrong section on purpose. "No heroics, no plan that will topple the whole building, just small, stubborn openings, a door left unlocked, a file nudged into a place someone curious might pull." I understood then. She couldn't speak directly against the system that employed her, couldn't risk open rebellion, but she could leave doors unlocked, files misfiled, documents in places where a determined researcher might stumble across them. "Thank you," I said quietly. She didn't respond at first, but her shoulders eased in a way that it was almost like relief. As I moved toward the unlocked cabinet, she spoke again, voice low enough that it might have been for her alone. "I let them go once," she said, each word measured, worn. "Bright ones, full of questions. I told myself silence was safety. But safety was the lie. I won't hide anymore, not if there's any way to pull one more out." Echoes under the East Cloister. Days later, the Archivum's restricted workshop record section felt like a tomb. The winter cold seeped through the walls, and my breath formed small clouds as I hunched over the scattered files Mira had made accessible. Technical documentation lay across the reading table, fragments of experimental logs, chemical formulations, and procedural notes someone had tried very hard to bury. I pulled my coat tighter and opened the first folder. The handwriting was cramped, clinical. Workshop log 47-B, mercury sulfide compounds, organic binding agents, absorption rates through dermal contact during extended reading sessions. My fingers went numb as I turned the pages. Specialized ink pigments, I read aloud, the lantern light guttering between the rafters. Psychological manipulation through marginalia exposure. The word sat heavy in the silence. I flipped more pages and found scattered references to deliberate experimentation, tests on people, students, the notes imply. The next file contained specifications that made my stomach clench. Mercury-based compounds mixed with organic extracts, plant derivatives abbreviated beyond recognition. The clinical entries described how these substances could induce dissociative states when absorbed through prolonged skin contact, reading sessions, fingers tracing margins, hours spent with books. The entries read like calibrated observations rather than conjecture. I set the file down and rubbed my eyes. The reflector lamps hissed softly, casting a thin pool of light across the documents. My hands felt dry, almost brittle from handling the old papers. Calibrated exposure protocols, I muttered, reading another fragment. Measured responses, duration of effects. But the records were incomplete, frustratingly so. Pages had been removed, sections redacted with thick ink. Someone had systematically destroyed the full procedures, leaving only enough to torment anyone who stumbled across them. The surviving scraps suggested controlled trials, measured exposures, response logs, but they stopped short of a clear chain of command or signed directives that would prove intent. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling. The pieces were there, scattered and broken, and they painted a picture I was reluctant to accept. The Academy's work, as recorded here, extends beyond mere scholarship into applied protocols that could be tested on subjects, possibly students, possibly others, but the ledger offers implication, not indictment. My sister's notebook sat in my bag, its pages damaged. I'd brought it hoping to find some connection, some explanation for what had happened to her. Now, with these workshop records spread before me, I was afraid of what I might discover. I drew the notebook out with trembling fingers. The cover was water-stained, the binding loose. Some pages were missing entirely, others barely legible. As I compared the fragments to the technical notes, my blood went cold. "Threshold compounds," I whispered, finding the phrase in both documents. "Perceptual barriers." The terminology mirrored the log entries, the same clinical tone, the same experimental focus. My sister hadn't simply been a student at the Academy. Her notes matched the protocols described here. It strongly suggests she had been exposed to the same compounds cataloged in Workshop Log 47-B, the same compounds cataloged in Workshop Log 47-B, though the absolute cause, who ordered it and whether intent was malicious or bureaucratic, remains unreadable in these fragments. I paged through her handwriting again, seeing it with new eyes. The erratic script, the gaps in memory, the strange symbols in the margins fell into an awful pattern. She'd recorded shifts and confusions that now read like measured responses, not merely private flights of fancy. Someone, or some procedure, had put those compounds into circulation, whether by design, negligence, or something stranger. I could not yet say. The archive felt smaller now, the walls pressing in. I gathered the files with shaking hands, my academic curiosity hardening into something more urgent. This was no longer just research to be cataloged. The documents point toward an institutional practice that intersected with my sister's fate, and they left an achingly clear demand. Find the ledger or the signature that turns implication into proof. That evening, I retreated to my quarters with my sister's few remaining possessions spread across my narrow desk. The lamplight cast harsh shadows over the meager collection, a torn notebook fragment, her silver locket, and a handful of letters I had read countless times before. But tonight, with the workshop records still fresh in my mind, I approached them differently. I picked up the notebook fragment first. The leather binding had cracked along the spine, and several pages were missing. What remained were scattered entries in her familiar writing, notes that had once seemed like the ordinary musings of a distracted student. Now, as I read them again, certain phrases jumped out. "Preparatory isolation proves more effective than anticipated," one line read. "The dissolution protocols require careful timing." My hand stilled on the page. Those weren't her words, not the way she would have naturally written. The phrasing was too clinical, too precise. It matched exactly the terminology I had found buried in the workshop records, the same cold language that described measured psychological manipulation. I set the notebook aside and took the locket. The silver was tarnished, but still opened with a soft click. Inside, where I expected a miniature portrait or a pressed flower, were tiny lines of text etched into the metal. I had noticed them before, but dismissed them as decorative. Under the lamplight, I could make out the words clearly. "Threshold compounds administered per standard protocol. Subject demonstrates expected perceptual barriers." The blood drained from my face. This wasn't decoration. This was documentation. "Gods," I whispered, my voice barely audible in the quiet room. The handwriting was unmistakably hers, but the words belonged to someone else's vocabulary, someone who spoke of students as subjects, who reduced human experience to clinical observations. The same someone who had written those workshop records, who had calibrated ink compounds to induce dissociative states. I compared the locket's text to the notebook fragment, then to my memory of the files. The terminology was identical. The phrasing patterns matched perfectly. She hadn't simply encountered these experimental processes. She had been documenting them. Whether willingly or under some form of compulsion, I couldn't tell. But the implications were clear. She hadn't just vanished. She had been processed through the Academy's hidden machinery, subjected to the same systematic procedures now being prepared for current students. The compounds, the protocols, the careful psychological manipulation. She had experienced all of it. "What did they do to you?" I asked the empty room. The silence offered no answers, but it confirmed my worst fears. Her disappearance wasn't random. It was methodical, institutional, and if the records were any indication, it was ongoing. I pushed back from the desk and pulled out every file I could access, every transfer record and administrative document I had clearance to review. If she had been moved through the Academy system, there would be traces, paper trails, some bureaucratic fingerprint that would show me where she had gone and what had happened to her. My hands shook as I spread the documents across my bed, my desk, even the floor. Somewhere in this maze of official records was the proof I needed. Somewhere was the signature that would turn my growing horror into actionable truth. I had to find it. I had to know. The documents remained scattered across my quarters for days, yielding nothing. No trace of her name in transfer logs, no administrative trail marking her passage through the Academy's machinery. It was as if she had simply dissolved into the institution's silence. Then came the evening when everything changed. I sat in the common study hall, bent over a dense treatise on medieval illumination techniques, when I heard a sharp intake of breath beside me. Celine sat at the adjacent table, pale fingers white-knuckled around an open book. "The threshold chambers," she whispered, barely audible above the scratch of quills and rustle of pages. "They're carved from living rock, deep beneath the east wing where—" Her words stopped. Her body stiffened and convulsed. "Celine?" I reached as she pitched forward, her chair scraping the stone floor. The other students looked up, but none moved. Her back arched, and when she spoke again, her voice had changed, deeper, hollow, as if it came from far beneath the Academy's foundations. Stone corridors descend beyond what they show us. Ritual spaces where they prepare us for the final. She collapsed, trembling. I caught her before she hit the floor. Her weight was surprisingly light. "Get the matron!" I called to the nearest student, but he had already turned back to his books. The medical chambers in the East Wing smelled of carbolic acid and a cloying sweetness from the workshop's chemicals. I sat beside Celine's narrow bed, her hands still trembling in mine, though the convulsions had passed. "You believe me," she said suddenly, eyes fixed on the ceiling. It wasn't a question. "Tell me what you saw." Her fingers tightened on mine. "Stone corridors that go down past the cellars, past the wine stores, into spaces carved from the bedrock. Chambers with symbols cut into the walls. Not Christian symbols, Adeline. Older things. Darker things." "How do you know this?" "I see them." Her voice steadied toward her usual fragile cadence. "In visions, not like dreams, more like windows opening. I see students taken when the moon is low. They're carried down in silence. I think that's where they're prepared. The same shapes keep repeating." The matron had given her something to calm her, but her eyes remained sharp. "You've been searching for something, haven't you? Someone?" I hesitated, then nodded. "My sister. She was here before me." "Then she may have gone to the chambers." Certainty shifted into a tentative hush. "I see them brought below. It feels like a preparation, wearing them down, marking them. They test us. They judge. Those they deem ready or dangerous are taken further under." She closed her eyes. "I could be wrong." Her grip on my hands turned desperate, as if I were the only thing anchoring her above ground. "Everyone thinks I'm mad. The matron, the other students, even the keepers. They call it hysteria." "But it's not." "No." She looked at me at last, a tremor before she spoke. "It's sight, true sight, and it's killing me because I can see what they're preparing for, and no one will listen." "Then we'll need proof," I said. Proof felt like the only thing that might anchor her claim and pierce the fog neither of us could afford. If this is more than a vision, there should be traces. Relief and fear crossed her face. "You will be the first to hear me, maybe the only one who will try." 3 days later, I stood in the east cloister as dawn filtered through narrow windows. Celine's words had lodged in my mind like splinters, and Mira's subtle guidance, a misfiled document here, an unlocked cabinet there, had sharpened my eye. The cloister seemed ordinary, stone arches, worn flagstones, religious carvings. As I walked the perimeter and ran my hand along the stonework, inconsistencies emerged. Joints that didn't quite align, stones that felt different, some robbed of mortar, others newly pointed to hide repairs. Where wall met floor, the course shifted, then resumed, as if someone had mended a seam and tried to erase it. In several stretches, mortar had been removed and replaced with care that betrayed attention but not openness, almost invisible seams among the older stone. I pressed at one section and felt a slight give, the kind that suggested hollow space behind the facing. It suggested, but did not prove, an aperture. I stepped back and traced the pattern again. Patches where the stone answered differently to touch, joints that hinted at intervention. If Celine's visions named a place, these irregularities named possibilities. They did not tell me which one, or whether any led where the visions claimed. "This could be nothing," I said to the empty cloister, more to steady myself than to convince anyone. "Or it could be the beginning of something that explains everything. We need to be careful." The wall gave no more answer. The Academy's foundations stretched deeper than anyone admitted, and somewhere in those hidden depths my sister might have walked the same path that now beckoned. I pressed my palm to the stone where the irregularities had caught my eye. The surface felt altered, deliberate, not just worn by centuries of passing students. My hand found gaps that shouldn't exist. "There has to be a mechanism," I whispered, running my hand along the wall. The Academy's builders wouldn't have left these changes without purpose. 3 feet to the left, a section of stone shifted under pressure and revealed a disguised panel. The mechanism was simple, a counterweight that required knowing exactly where to push. The panel swung inward with barely a whisper. Cool air rushed out, smelling of damp stone and something medicinal. I lit the small oil lamp I'd brought and stepped through the narrow opening. The space beyond was larger than I'd expected, carved from the living rock beneath the Academy. It wasn't the size that stopped me. It was what someone had done with it. Heavy wooden furniture filled the center, but closer inspection made the pieces horrifying. A desk hid leather restraints on its surface. The chair's straps passed for upholstery, but ended in metal fittings. "Jesus," I breathed, setting the lamp on a stone ledge. Narrow slots at eye level allowed unseen observation. I pressed my face to one and looked into a smaller, empty chamber. Ventilation shafts ran along the ceiling, too elaborate for storage, meant to keep fresh air during long occupancy. Someone had planned for people to spend considerable time here, whether they wanted to or not. At the far wall, another panel sat slightly ajar. Beyond it, a corridor stretched into darkness, branching at regular intervals into a network absent from the Academy's plans. "They move them through here," I said aloud, my voice echoing. "From the quiet cells to where?" I followed the main corridor, counting steps to keep my bearings. The passages were well built, with drainage and air circulation. This wasn't a hastily dug tunnel, but a planned system. The first branch opened into another modified chamber. The second led to a preparation room. Stone tables, metal fixtures whose purpose I didn't want to imagine, and floor drains. I backed out of that room, hands shaking around the lamp. A pattern emerged. Each chamber served a stage in a process. Students were brought from the quiet cells, places the Academy called isolation, to these hidden rooms. Here they would be prepared. For what? I couldn't yet name, but the evidence pointed to something far worse than discipline. The final corridor ended at a junction of 3 passages, one returning to the Academy, one descending deeper, and the third blocked by a heavy iron-banded door. I tried the handle. It was locked. Through the keyhole, I could see only darkness. "This is where they take them," I whispered, stepping back. "After isolation, after preparation, this is where they disappear." The system made my stomach turn. The Academy hadn't merely hidden troubled students or covered accidents. It had built an infrastructure to process people, breaking down resistance and preparing them for whatever lay beyond that door. My sister had walked this path. The notebook fragments, the matching terminology, she had been brought through these chambers and subjected to whatever they did. I pressed my back to the stone and tried to steady my breathing. The weight of discovery settled on my shoulders. Every student who simply left, how many had passed through this network? The lamp flickered. I couldn't stay. As I prepared to retrace my steps, I noticed scratches in the stone near the locked door, deliberate marks, as if someone had tried to leave a message. I brought the lamp closer and felt my heart stop. Carved into the stone were 2 letters, A, B. For a moment I thought of myself, Adeline Blackwell, then saw the tiny slanted cross through the A and the short downward tick finishing the B, Adelaide's flourish from the margins of her notebooks. She had been here. She had stood in this spot, facing that locked door, and found the strength to leave proof she had existed. I traced the letters with my fingertip, feeling the rough edges where she'd worked to make them last. How long had she spent on this? Had she known what lay beyond, or only hoped someone would find her mark? "I found you," I whispered to the stone. "I know what they did to you." But knowing wasn't enough. The locked door kept its secrets, and above the academy the process continued with new victims, students like Celine, whose visions had led me here. I had found the mechanism, but not its purpose. The isolation, the hidden chambers, the preparations, all funneled to that door and whatever waited in the deeper dark. The academy's true curriculum wasn't education. It was something far more sinister, and I was only beginning to understand its scope. The darkness beneath the academy held its secrets, but the records above told their own story. I emerged from the East Cloister with grim purpose, my sister's notebook clutched against my chest like armor against what I might find. The following days blurred in a haze of ledgers and logs. Mira had left administrative offices unlocked again, and I moved through the keeper record chambers like a hunter tracking wounded prey. The transfer logs sat in neat stacks on wooden tables. Their bindings were worn smooth by countless hands. Each page held fragments of lives redirected, students whose paths had been quietly altered. I spread Matron Hester's records across the table first. Her handwriting was precise, each entry dated and signed with flourishes that spoke of pride. But as I compared her logs to other keepers, contradictions emerged like cracks in a painted wall. "Student reassigned to East Wing quarters for academic focus," Hester had written about Catherine Morse. Keeper Aldwin's housing log showed Catherine remaining in the North Dormitory for 3 more weeks. The dates didn't match. The locations didn't align. I pulled more files, hands quicker. Thomas Hartwell. Hester marked him transferred to special supervision on the 15th of October. Aldwin had him attending regular classes through the end of the month. 2 different realities, recorded by 2 different hands. "Disciplinary review completed. Student returned to standard housing," read another of Hester's entries. There was no corresponding note in the disciplinary logs, no record of any review taking place. The gaps weren't random. They followed a pattern, like steps in a dance I was only beginning to learn. Students would appear in one keeper's records, vanish from another's, then resurface in a third set of logs with altered circumstances. The documentation created a maze of false trails, each keeper's version contradicting the others just enough to make the truth impossible to follow. I found Rowan's name buried in a stack of housing transfers from the previous autumn. Hester's neat script recorded his move from the main dormitory to restricted quarters in the East Wing. "Student requires additional supervision due to concerning behavior patterns," she had written. Aldwin's log told a different story. Rowan had asked for the move himself, citing a need for quieter study conditions. The same shift, but the reasons were opposites, one framed as punishment, the other as choice. I traced his path through the records like following breadcrumbs through a forest. First, the move to restricted housing, justified by behavioral concerns that appeared in some logs but not others. Then a transfer to what Hester called specialized academic support, a program that existed in her files but nowhere else in the Academy's official documentation. The final entry was the most chilling. "Student withdrawn by family request." Hester had written in her careful script. There was no family correspondence in the files, no letters requesting withdrawal, no forwarding address or destination recorded. Rowan Pike had simply vanished from the official record, erased as thoroughly as if he had never existed at all. I found similar patterns for other students. Names appeared and disappeared, transfers led nowhere, programs existed only in certain keepers' logs. The Academy had created a system of coordinated deception, each keeper maintaining their piece of the lie while the whole truth remained hidden. My sister's notebook lay open beside the ledgers, her damaged handwriting barely legible in the lamplight. The words I could make out matched the terminology in the transfer logs with terrifying precision.
Preparatory isolation, she had written, threshold protocols.
The same phrases that appeared in Hester's most recent entries. The methodology I had learned from preserving her damaged writings served me now. Where pages were torn, I looked for impressions left on the sheets beneath. Where ink had faded, I held the paper to the light to catch traces of the original text. Where records contradicted each other, I searched for the truth hidden in the spaces between the lies. The secret roots I had discovered beneath the East Cloister made sense now. Students weren't simply moved from room to room. They were transported through hidden passages that kept their movements invisible to the rest of the Academy. The altered documentation provided cover for transfers that never appeared in official logs, creating a parallel system that operated in the shadows of the legitimate one. I spread my findings across the table like pieces of a puzzle. The pattern was clear now. Isolation, preparation, erasure. Students were first moved to restricted housing where their activities could be monitored and controlled. Then they were transferred to specialized programs that existed only in certain records. Programs that prepared them for something the files never explicitly named. Finally, they disappeared entirely, their existence scrubbed from the official documentation through carefully coordinated lies. The Academy wasn't just hiding individual transfers. It was operating an entire shadow system, complete with its own housing, its own supervision, and its own methods of making students vanish without a trace. And at the center of it all was that locked door in the depths below, the final destination that no record dared to name. I closed the ledgers and gathered my sister's notebook against my chest. The truth was worse than I had imagined, but at least now I understood the scope of what I was fighting. The Academy's true curriculum wasn't education. It was the systemic harvesting of students for purposes that remained hidden in the darkness below. But I had found their methods. I had traced their lies. And somewhere in those shadows, my sister's fate waited to be discovered. The weight of discovery settled over me like winter fog as I made my way through the Academy's corridors that night. Sleep felt impossible after what I had uncovered in those ledgers. The systemic erasure, the careful lies, the coordinated deception. It all pointed to something far more organized than random disappearances. But I needed more than patterns and gaps. I needed the philosophical foundation that could justify such calculated cruelty. Aldrich's private office waited in the administrative wing, its heavy door unlocked thanks to Mira's subtle assistance. The room smelled of leather and old paper, lined with shelves that reached toward the shadowed ceiling. His desk dominated the space, its surface meticulously organized despite the late hour. But it was the filing cabinets behind his chair that drew my attention. Rows of correspondence and private memoranda that might hold the answers I desperately sought. I opened the first drawer and began my methodical examination. The folders were labeled with faculty names, dates, and cryptic references to pedagogical advancement and institutional evolution. As I read the earliest files, his careful handwriting emerged from the pages like a voice speaking directly to me. The pursuit of transcendent knowledge one memo began, requires transcendent sacrifice. We cannot allow sentiment to obstruct our duty to understanding itself. My hands trembled slightly as I read further. These weren't ravings of a madman. They were reasoned arguments, carefully constructed philosophical frameworks that transformed cruelty into academic necessity. He had written extensively to his colleagues, building his case with the methodical precision of a scholar proving a theorem. Individual suffering, another document explained, becomes meaningless when weighed against the advancement of human knowledge. We are not torturers, we are pioneers, pushing beyond the comfortable boundaries of conventional ethics to discover truths that lesser minds cannot comprehend. I found correspondence between him and other faculty members, exchanges that revealed the gradual conversion of the Academy's leadership. Professor Whitmore, Marcus's father, had initially expressed reservations in a letter dated 3 years prior. "Thaddeus," he had written, "I cannot reconcile these methods with the principles that brought me to teaching. Surely there must be other paths to knowledge that do not require such extremes." But the reply was masterful in its persuasion. He didn't dismiss Whitmore's concerns. He embraced them, reframing them as evidence of the professor's moral sensitivity, which made his eventual participation all the more valuable. "Your reluctance honors you, Edmund," the response read. "It proves you understand the gravity of what we undertake. But consider this. Every great advancement in human understanding has required someone willing to bear the burden of difficult choices. The physicians who first dissected human bodies were called monsters by their contemporaries. Yet without their courage, medicine would have remained trapped in ignorance. We stand at a similar threshold." I traced the correspondence through months of exchanges, watching as Whitmore's objections gradually softened under relentless logic. His letters grew shorter, his protests weaker, until finally he wrote only, "I defer to your judgment in these matters. May we be forgiven for what we deem necessary." Other faculty members had followed similar trajectories. Professor Hartwell, a senior fellow of the Order of Alteration known for empirical rigor, had questioned the ethics of using students as subjects. The reply was a manipulation, appealing to scholarly ambition for some, to fear of irrelevance for others, to simple greed for those motivated by material concerns. "Your expertise in the techniques of alteration makes you uniquely qualified to appreciate the significance of our work," one letter argued. "I would hate to see such valuable insight wasted on mundane instruction when it could contribute to discoveries that will reshape human understanding. Of course, if you feel unequal to the intellectual demands of our research." The threat was never stated directly, but Hartwell's subsequent letters showed complete capitulation. Within weeks, he was contributing his own suggestions for experimental protocols and subject selection criteria. As I read deeper into the files, I found evidence of the Academy's entire leadership structure being systematically converted through tailored arguments. He had crafted different approaches for different personalities, appealing to ambition for some, to fear for others, to greed for those motivated by material concerns. But what chilled me most was how he had addressed the few who continued to resist. Their files contained increasingly terse exchanges, followed by transfer requests, resignation letters, or, in some cases, simply empty folders marked "reassigned, record sealed." "The institution must be protected from those who lack the vision to understand our mission," he had written to the Council of Senior Fellows. "Sentiment and squeamishness have no place in the pursuit of ultimate truth." I stared at a particular memo dated just 6 months ago, addressed to the entire faculty. It was his clearest statement of philosophy, a document that laid bare the intellectual framework supporting the Academy's hidden activities. "We have moved beyond the primitive constraints of conventional morality. it declared. Our work requires us to embrace a higher ethics, one that values knowledge above comfort, truth above sentiment, and progress above the preservation of individual lives that would otherwise contribute nothing to human advancement. Each subject we study brings us closer to understanding the fundamental nature of consciousness itself. Their sacrifice serves a purpose greater than any single existence could achieve through conventional living. The memo continued with detailed justifications for the Academy's methods, explaining how controlled isolation and systematic psychological pressure were necessary tools for accessing altered states of consciousness that revealed hidden truths about human perception and reality. As I read these clinical descriptions of torture disguised as research, I understood how the faculty had been able to participate in such horrors. He hadn't simply convinced them to abandon their ethics. He had provided a new ethical framework that transformed cruelty into noble purpose. Yet even within this corrupted system, traces of resistance remained. Scattered throughout the correspondence were subtle signs that not everyone had been completely convinced. Professor Ashworth of Philology, a circumspect correspondent, wrote carefully neutral replies that revealed nothing of his true feelings. Dr. Pemberton, the Academy's chief physic, had requested transfers for several students, citing health concerns that were overruled. Most telling were the gaps. Faculty who had simply stopped responding, their silence speaking louder than any written protest. These quiet resistors had been systematically removed from positions of influence, reassigned to harmless duties, or encouraged to seek employment elsewhere. The Academy's mission is too important to be compromised by those who lack the intellectual courage to embrace necessary truths, he wrote in a memo recommending the dismissal of 3 members who had questioned the ethics of the program. As dawn approached, I sat surrounded by evidence of how institutional evil could be rationalized through appeals to higher purpose. He had created a complete philosophical system that justified any cruelty so long as it served the advancement of knowledge. He had converted his colleagues not through force or bribery, but through careful intellectual seduction that made them complicit in their own moral corrosion. The most disturbing aspect was how reasonable it all sounded in measured prose. He never advocated cruelty for its own sake. Everything was framed as regrettable necessity in service of transcendent goals. The students weren't victims. They were subjects contributing to humanity's greatest intellectual advancement. The torture wasn't sadism. It was carefully controlled research into the boundaries of human consciousness. I closed the final folder and leaned back in the chair, my mind reeling from what I had discovered. The Academy's horrors weren't the product of individual madness or random cruelty. They were the result of a systematic philosophical framework that had converted an entire institution to a twisted vision of academic purpose. But even as I grasped the scope of the intellectual corruption, I realized the most damning evidence remained carefully obscured. While the memos revealed philosophical justifications, they never explicitly connected specific faculty members to particular acts of cruelty. The correspondence spoke in euphemisms and abstractions, leaving the actual implementation of their theories to be inferred rather than documented. It was a masterful system of plausible deniability. If questioned, any member could claim they had only engaged in theoretical discussions about the ethics of knowledge acquisition. The gap between philosophy and practice had been deliberately maintained, protecting participants while enabling continued involvement. I gathered the documents back into their folders, understanding that I had uncovered something far more dangerous than simple criminal activity. I had found the intellectual foundation of institutional evil, a carefully constructed system of rationalization that could transform ordinary academics into willing participants in systematic horror, all while allowing them to maintain their self-image as noble seekers of truth. The academy hadn't just stolen students like my sister. It had stolen the souls of its faculty, converting them into willing servants of a philosophy that valued knowledge above humanity itself. And somewhere in the shadows of that corrupted institution, the practical implementation of those theories continued, hidden behind layers of euphemism and intellectual justification that made the truth almost impossible to prove. The weight of those revelations pressed against my chest as I made my way back through the darkened corridors. But dawn brought no respite. Instead, it brought Inspector Harwick. I first noticed him during morning meal, a thin man in academy grays who moved through the dining hall with the measured steps of someone cataloging everything he saw. He took his place beside Matron Hester at the dais, pale-eyed, his gaze a line drawn through the room. Whispers named him a council-appointed investigator on loan to the keepers, a specialist in compliance audits and materials review. He spoke little, but his presence tightened the hall like a drawn wire, the kind the academy sent when the candle ledger didn't suffice. "Routine materials inspection," Matron Hester announced after breakfast, her voice carrying the forced cheer she used when delivering unwelcome news. "All students are to return to their quarters and remain available for questioning. Inspector Harwick will be overseeing the audit, and Nathaniel will act as student liaison for the inquiry." The mention of Nathaniel stung. The timing felt too convenient, coming so soon after my discoveries in Aldrich's files. But when the knock came at my door 2 hours later, it wasn't Harwick who entered. Footsteps paused outside, measured, deliberate, the same cadence I'd watched circling the tables at breakfast. When the door opened, Nathaniel stepped in. He carried his usual confidence, but something in his bearing had gone colder, more calculating. "Good morning, Adeline," he said, closing the door behind him. "I hope you slept well." "Well enough." I watched him carefully. "I didn't expect to see you during an inspection." "Of course not," Nathaniel said, moving to my desk and letting his hand rest on the surface, as if it were another ledger. "Inspector Harwick asked me to speak with you first. He thought you might respond better to a fellow student." Those words landed like ice. Respond better to what? Nathaniel turned, and for a moment his voice kept the polished ease that had drawn people to him, now sharpened. "About your recent visits to the archives. Your access patterns have been irregular. Someone needs to ask about them." "I don't know what you mean," I said, though my throat had gone tight. "Don't you?" He pulled a folded sheaf of papers from his jacket. "I have a log of every restricted file you've opened this month. Times, terminals, the sections you lingered on. Mira's assistants noted here, too." My mouth went dry. "Where did you get that?" He smiled without warmth. "From the proper systems. From people who keep the books. I keep my own records, Adeline. It's prudent." "Why?" I asked, the word small against the press in my chest. "Order," he said simply. "The academy depends on order. Students who stray into forbidden stacks risk more than themselves. They risk the institution. Inspector Harwick takes these things seriously." The betrayal solidified into something physical. All the late conversations, the shared looks of concern about the missing students, had been performance. He'd been collecting, not confiding. "You used me," I said. "I observed you," Nathaniel corrected, almost conversationally. "I documented your protocol breaches. When I needed to show allegiance, I handed that documentation where it would count." "What about Marcus? Rowan?" My voice cracked on their names. I was concerned, Nathaniel allowed, his tone steady, measured, but one must choose priorities. Marcus kept contraband openly. That's a hazard. Rowan, he doesn't fit here. People like him don't survive the scrutiny. He produced a torn page, my sister's handwriting, unmistakable, even fragmented. Where did you get that? From your quarters, during one of your late visits, he said, holding it as if admiring the script. You leave traces, Adeline. People are careless when they believe themselves invisible. This page references dissolution protocols and threshold compounds, language that matches certain restricted texts quite closely. My legs wobbled. That doesn't prove anything. It proves enough, Nathaniel said. Couple this with the access logs and your pattern of seeking forbidden materials, and Inspector Harwick approved a review. He asked me to bring these to him. The room tilted. Everything I'd sought to uncover was being turned into a web that trapped me. What do you want? I asked, though I feared the answer. Nathaniel's expression was almost pitying. Not want, duty. Consequence. The Academy tolerates infractions until it must not. A sharp knock interrupted us. Nathaniel opened the door to admit Harwick, a pale-eyed man whose gaze swept the room as though filing it away. Miss Blackwell, he said, stepping in, we need to discuss your activities. Nathaniel handed him the papers with smooth efficiency. Inspector, the access logs, the restricted materials, and evidence of prior knowledge. Harwick read with expression. When his head came up, his words were flat and final. Miss Blackwell, you are reassigned to supervised study, effective immediately. Archival privileges revoked. You will relocate to restricted housing in the East Wing. Those phrases, supervised study, restricted housing, tasted like erasure. I had seen that progression before. A slow, administrative strangling until a student vanished. On what grounds? I managed. Unauthorized access to classified documents, possession of contraband materials, violations of Academy protocols, Harwick recited. The evidence is comprehensive. Nathaniel watched as if observing a plan come to fruition, satisfaction tucked neatly behind his composure. He'd removed a rival, proved his usefulness, and kept his hands clean. You will pack your essential belongings, Harwick continued. A keeper will escort you within the hour. As they turned to leave, Nathaniel paused in the doorway. I'm sorry it came to this, Adeline, but the Academy values devotion to its rules. The door closed, and the room felt suddenly too small. Alone among my scattered things, a single thought burned. Supervised study and the East Wing meant erasure. They meant modification. They meant silence. My time had shrunk to hours. If I was ever going to learn what happened to my sister and to students like Rowan and Marcus, I had to move before they moved me. I knew how the machinery worked now, and who fed bodies into it. Blueprints and broken rights. That same evening, I slipped from my quarters before the night watch began their rounds. The Academy's corridors felt different now, not just watched, but actively hostile. Every shadow could hide an observer. Every creak of floorboard could summon unwanted attention. The keeper's hearth off the west corridor sat empty, its dying embers casting weak light across worn stone. I knelt beside the loose brick Mira had shown me weeks ago and quickly extracted the first cache. The oiled cloth contained fragments of parchment, some barely larger than my thumb, others torn sheets covered in cramped handwriting. I spread them across the hearth's edge, close enough to the fading fire to read, but far enough to avoid singeing the precious evidence. The first fragment bore Mason's distinctive script, Master Mason Corbett, whose field hand I recognize from maintenance folios and council dispatches. Architectural notes describing foundational modifications to accommodate specialized conduits. His diagrams showed the basement extending far beyond what I'd imagined, with passages running beneath the east cloister and continuing under Lake Lucht itself. Deliberate integration of ceremonial chambers, I read aloud, load-bearing walls repositioned to create acoustic resonance points. It hadn't simply been built over something older. The place had been assembled as a purpose-built apparatus, an architectural program designed to exert influence. I took the fragments to the Archivum's back room, where the retired ledger chest held Mira's second cache. The technical notes there made my skin crawl. Someone, the handwriting was unfamiliar, had documented ink formulations with clinical precision. Mercury compounds mixed with organic extracts, their chemical properties designed to interact synergistically with marginalia geometries to induce controlled dissociative states in subjects during extended reading sessions. My hands shook as I read further. The inks weren't just for writing. They were for changing the reader's mind, creating vulnerability, opening pathways for suggestion and control. Every book I'd handled, every manuscript I'd cataloged, how many had been treated with these compounds? The sealed maintenance niche beneath the east cloister required more care to access. I pried loose a section of stone flooring. The scraping sound echoed too loudly in the narrow space. What I found there confirmed my worst fears. Construction fragments, pieces of carved stone and metal fittings, told the story of ritual installations built directly into the structure, not added later, not hidden in secret rooms, but integrated into the very walls and foundations. The dining hall's peculiar acoustics, the library's disorienting layout, the way certain corridors seemed to draw students toward specific destinations, all of it had been planned. I sat back on my heels, surrounded by evidence of decades of careful preparation. The fragments began to connect in my mind like pieces of a vast, terrible puzzle. Years of reconstructing my sister's damaged writings had taught me to see patterns in chaos, to find meaning in scattered remnants. Mason's architectural modifications created the physical framework. The specialized inks provided the chemical component. The ritual installations supplied the psychological triggers. Together, they transformed apparent academic spaces into sophisticated mechanisms for breaking down resistance and reshaping minds. It wasn't just hiding crimes. It was the crime's instrument, a purpose-built engine for psychological manipulation, designed to identify promising students and either convert them into willing servants or eliminate them entirely. I thought of my sister's notebook, her increasingly erratic handwriting, the way her thoughts had fragmented toward the end. She hadn't been losing her mind. She'd been fighting for it, struggling against a system designed to strip away everything that made her herself. The devastating truth settled over me like a shroud. Every student who'd walked these halls, every young person who'd come seeking knowledge, had been subjected to this architecture of control. And those who'd resisted, who'd proven too strong or too stubborn to break, they'd simply disappeared. I gathered the fragments with trembling hands, my obsessive attention to detail now serving a purpose I'd never imagined. Tomorrow they would move me to supervise study in the East Wing, where the apparatus was strongest, where the final modifications took place. But tonight, I finally understood what I was fighting. The silence that followed was heavy with meaning. Every fragment I had pieced together, every terrible revelation, had left its mark on the walls around me. I walked away from the ledger chest with the impression that something had ended, though I could not quite name what. The weight of understanding pressed against my chest as the last echoes of discovery faded. Hours before dawn found me deeper in the archivum, among the most recent batch of test reports Mira had quietly shifted within my reach. The storage area was colder, more oppressive, as if the building sensed the approaching change. I moved through the files with practiced efficiency, but my heart hammered as I read. The documentation painted a picture that filled me with dread. Session reports from the past months described fluctuating effects during marginalia exposure tests. Some students experienced what the keepers clinically termed accelerated dissociative episodes, their minds fragmenting faster than anticipated. Others showed unexpected resistance to the psychological conditioning, their personalities proving more stubborn than the protocols could break. Subject 47 demonstrated anomalous retention of pre-exposure memories, one report noted in Matron Hester's precise handwriting. Recommend immediate transfer to enhanced conditioning protocols. My hands shook as I turned the page. Anomalous readings tied to the academy grounds suggested that the ritual installations themselves were becoming unstable. The carefully calibrated mechanisms built into the building's foundation were producing unpredictable effects, their influence growing increasingly dangerous and erratic. Fluctuations in the East Cloister Chamber exceeded safe parameters by 37%. Another document warned. Installation requires immediate recalibration or temporary shutdown. But they weren't shutting anything down. Instead, the keepers had begun altering movement patterns in response to the instability. Some student transfers were accelerated, rushed through before the installations could malfunction completely. Others were moved along shifted routes to avoid detection by those beginning to remember suppressed experiences. Recommend alternate pathway through the North Passage, Nathaniel's familiar handwriting suggested in one margin. Subject 23 has been observed near the standard transfer route during evening hours. The betrayal cut. Seeing his participation documented so matter-of-factly, he wasn't just reporting my activities, he was actively helping refine their methods. As I read these clinical descriptions of psychological destruction, I thought of Celine's worsening episodes, her midnight visits, her fragmented warnings, the way she sometimes stared at nothing as if seeing through the walls. She reminded me so powerfully of my lost sister, that same fragile intensity, that same desperate need to make someone understand what others couldn't see. The realization hit like a physical blow. Vulnerable students like Celine were at immediate risk from this deteriorating system. The academy's apparatus of control was breaking down, becoming more violent and unpredictable in its death throes. And the keeper's response wasn't to stop. It was to work faster, to process more students before the whole structure collapsed. I pressed my hand against my mouth to stifle the sound that wanted to escape. Tomorrow they would move me to the East Wing, where these unstable installations would begin their work on my mind. But tonight, surrounded by evidence of their growing desperation, I finally understood the full scope of what I was fighting against. The system was failing, and in its failure, it was becoming more dangerous than ever. The hours blurred until dawn crept through the archive windows, and I knew I had to return to my quarters before the morning shift arrived. But sleep wouldn't come. I sat on my narrow bed, staring at the wall until the light outside shifted to gold. When the knock came that evening, just as the sun was setting, I wasn't surprised. 2 keepers stood in my doorway, not Mira, but older men I recognized from the administrative offices. One held a folder, thick with official papers. "Miss Blackwell," the taller one said, his voice carrying the practiced tone of someone who delivered unwelcome news regularly. "We are here regarding your academic standing." I stepped back and let them enter. The shorter keeper stayed by the door while his companion opened the folders and withdrew a document bearing the academy's seal. "You're to undergo a supervised examination to determine your fitness for continued archival work," he continued, scanning the page as if reading from a script. It's a standard procedure, nothing to be concerned about. The evaluation will assess your current mental state and academic capabilities."
The shorter keeper nodded.
"Completely routine," he said.
"We've had several students go through the same process this term. Most find it quite straightforward."
The reassurances felt hollow, each word chosen to soothe rather than inform. I'd heard this bureaucratic language before, in the transfer documents I'd found, in the notes about specialized programs and individualized assessments. The phrasing matched, down to the emphasis on routine procedures and standard evaluations.
"When?"
I asked. "Now, I'm afraid, the examining committee is waiting." I pulled on my coat, my hand brushing the hidden pockets where I'd sewn the fragments from my sister's notebook and the most damning records from my investigation. The weight of the papers pressed against my ribs as I slipped my arms through the sleeves. "Shall we?" The taller keeper gestured through the corridor. We walked through passages I'd mapped through my weeks of searching, past the junction leading to the sealed maintenance areas, around the corner where I'd first glimpsed the hidden cache beneath the loose stone. The keepers flanked me, their footsteps echoing in the narrow space. They didn't speak, though I caught them exchange glances when they thought I wasn't looking.
"The east cloister has excellent natural light,"
the shorter one offered as we turned down a corridor I knew led toward the ritual installations.
"Very conducive to focused work."
The east cloister, where the unstable marginalia effects were strongest, where the technical notes described the most sophisticated psychological conditioning apparatus. My coat felt heavier with each step. The hidden documents reminded me this wasn't just about my academic future or finding answers about my sister.
"How many students have taken this examination recently?" I asked.
"Oh, several," the taller keeper replied without looking at me. "The Academy is committed to ensuring each student receives the attention they deserve." Attention. Another phrase from the files, always preceding a student's disappearance from the official records. I thought of Rowan Pike, of Marcus Whitmore, of all the names carefully erased from the ledgers. The system was claiming victims through its methodical process of evaluation and elimination, and now it was my turn to face that machinery. But I carried with me the knowledge they thought was safely buried. Every step toward the East Cloister was also a step toward exposing what they'd worked so hard to conceal. "Please step forward," one of the keepers said, his practiced courtesy carrying the same tone I had heard in the corridors above.
"The Academy has always valued thorough documentation," the second keeper said, arranging papers on a smaller table. "We find that proper preparation ensures the most accurate results."
"Interesting craftsmanship," I said, keeping my voice steady. "The builders were quite skilled," the first keeper agreed. "Every element serves its purpose."
"These markings," I said, tracing one with my finger, "they match descriptions I've encountered in my archival work." "You have a good eye," the other keeper said, folding a sheet and setting it in the pattern. "Attention like that makes the process easier for everyone." "The process requires careful calibration," he explained, adjusting the position of one text. "Each subject responds differently."
"My sister," I said quietly. "She went through this same process, didn't she?"
"The Academy has helped many students over the years," one replied. "Each case is handled discreetly." "The examination will begin shortly," the second keeper said, folding his hands as if offering comfort. "Remain calm and cooperate. The subject responds best when they do not resist."
The chamber they led me into was smaller than I expected, carved from the same stone as the Academy's foundations, but polished to an unnatural smoothness. Gas lamps flickered along the walls, casting shadows that seemed to move independently of their flames. I moved deeper into the room, my eyes adjusting to the dim light. What I had taken for study furniture at first glance revealed itself under closer examination. The chair near the center had leather straps at the arms and legs, worn smooth from use. The writing desk against the far wall had rings bolted into its surface. and grooves carved into the wood suggested restraints had been tested there many times. I stepped closer to the walls and ran my fingers along what appeared to be decorative molding. The panels gave slightly under pressure, revealing hinged sections. Behind one, I glimpsed a narrow slot at eye level, an observation window disguised as architectural detail. The ventilation grates near the ceiling were larger than necessary for air circulation. Their placement suggested they could distribute more than fresh air throughout the chamber. I thought of the specialized inks I had read about in the workshop records, their chemical properties designed to affect the mind through inhalation as well as contact. Along the walls, carved symbols caught the lamplight. The geometries were familiar. I had seen similar patterns in the forbidden codices, described as focusing mechanisms for psychological effects. The angles and intersections followed precise mathematical relationships, their purpose hidden behind the guise of decorative work. They began arranging instruments on the table, implements I couldn't identify, glass vials containing liquids, and several texts bound in leather. The books fell open to pages dense with marginalia, the handwritten notes forming patterns that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. Conditioning. The word confirmed what I had suspected since entering this chamber. This was where students like Rowan Pike had been brought, where the Academy's true work was conducted away from the official records and public scrutiny. They exchanged a glance. "The Academy has helped many students over the years," one replied. "Each case is handled discreetly." I watched them arrange the marginalia-inscribed texts in a specific pattern around the chair. The pages they selected bore notes in different hands, as if multiple scholars had contributed to their development over time. The ink itself seemed to absorb the lamp rather than reflect it. Standing in that chamber, surrounded by the instruments of psychological manipulation disguised as academic tools, I understood that my refusal to let another person vanish without a trace had brought me to the same threshold my sister had likely crossed. The knowledge I carried, the fragments from her notebook, the evidence of the Academy's systematic erasure of inconvenient witnesses, might die with me in this room. But they didn't know what I had learned, or how much documentation I had already assembled. Each carved symbol, restraint mechanism, and chemical compound described in their records formed a pattern of deliberate cruelty disguised as scholarly necessity. The keepers continued their preparations, confident in their routine. They had done this before, many times, with students who had asked too many questions or discovered too much truth. But none of those students had spent months reconstructing damaged writings, developing the patience and attention to detail necessary to see through the Academy's carefully constructed deceptions. I was ready for whatever came next. I moved quickly, my hands steady despite the adrenaline. The first target was obvious, the chemical delivery apparatus on the chamber's eastern wall. According to my sister's notebook fragment, these systems required precise calibration. I pulled the vial of ink solvent from my coat pocket and introduced it into the main feed line. The reaction was immediate. A grinding sound echoed as the mechanism seized, their chemistry disrupted by the foreign compound. One of the keepers looked up from his preparations, frowning at the noise. "What was that?" he asked his companion.
"Probably the heating system," the other replied, not bothering to look. "These old chambers have their quirks."
While they arranged their texts and instruments, I moved to the next phase. The hidden conduits that channeled psychological influence ran beneath the stone floor, but their access points were marked by subtle variations in the masonry, details I had memorized from the construction fragments. I found the primary junction near the chamber's center and pressed at the weak points my research had identified. The stone cracked with a sharp snap that neither keeper could ignore. "That definitely wasn't the heating system," the first one said, rising from his work. Before he could investigate, the mounts holding the concealed panels began to fail. The pressure I had applied created a cascade, compromising the network of supports. Panel after panel gave way with metallic groans and crashes, revealing compartments sealed for years.
"What the hell?"
The second keeper started, but his words were lost in the chaos. Documents spilled from the open compartments, some pages faded to near transparency, others marked by recent erasure, ink scratched out, pages torn, sections slated for destruction. The breakdown of the chamber's systems pushed these suppressed materials back into sight, their contents surfacing like evidence in disturbed water. Faded pages scattered across the stone floor, each one bearing witness to experiments that should never have been conducted on unwilling subjects. Names I didn't recognize, dates spanning decades, detailed observations of psychological deterioration and chemical effects. The Academy's true work, laid bare by the failure of the mechanisms meant to hide it. The keepers stood frozen, staring at the destruction. Their controlled environment had become a scene of mechanical failure and exposed secrets, their routine derailed by forces they couldn't understand. The chamber's collapse was only the beginning. I left the keepers among their scattered secrets and moved through corridors that felt different now, charged with an energy I couldn't name. The Academy's familiar halls stretched before me. Something had shifted in the air. Students moved with hesitation, their eyes unfocused as if seeing ghosts in the shadows. Near the west wing, I found a girl from the dining hall sitting against the wall, knees to her chest. She stared at nothing, lips moving in a silent conversation with memories surfacing like debris after a storm.
"I remember the room," she whispered as I passed. "The white room with the chair. They said it was for my own good, but I remember now. I remember the taste of copper and the way the walls moved."
I stopped. "What room?" She looked up with too much knowledge.
"You know, the one where they make you forget." Her voice cracked. "But I'm remembering anyway. We all are."
Down the corridor, two boys stood close together, comparing fragments in hushed, urgent tones. "The ink," he said. "Do you remember the ink? How it burned when you looked at it too long?"
"And the keeper with the scar on his hand. He always asked the same questions afterward, about what we saw, what we felt."
"But we weren't supposed to remember any of it." Their words faded as I moved deeper into the Academy. But similar scenes played out in every hallway. Students clustered in small groups, piecing together experience they'd been conditioned to forget. Others wandered alone, their faces marked by the particular horror of recovered memory. The administrative wing buzzed with a different energy, voices carried through closed doors, sharp with authority and barely controlled panic. I pressed myself against the wall near the records office and listened. "Need to secure the remaining files immediately. Sir, we can't find the keys to the sealed cabinets. Someone's moved them." "Then break them open if you have to. We can't let any more material surface." Footsteps pounded as keepers rushed between offices, arms full of ledgers and loose papers. Familiar faces, usually composed and authoritative, now showed the strain of trying to maintain control over something spiraling beyond them. "Where's Matron Hester?" someone called. "Relocating the priority subjects, the ones who've shown the strongest memory recovery. And the new transfers? Delayed indefinitely. We can't process anyone until we understand the extent of the breach." I slipped past them and found a corridor I'd rarely visited, where the senior staff kept private offices. Here the chaos was more organized, but no less desperate. Through an open doorway, Inspector Harwick bent over a desk, sorting documents. "This one goes to the incinerator," he said, tossing a sheaf toward the bin. "This too. Anything dated before 1847, destroy it tonight." Even as they worked, they were losing the battle. Papers littered floors where filing cabinets had been emptied. Doors stood ajar that should have been locked. In their rush to contain the damage, they'd created new opportunities for exposure. I turned the corner and nearly collided with Mira, carrying an armload of files toward another secure location. "Adeline." Her voice was carefully neutral, but her eyes held a message I understood immediately. She shifted the files, and several papers slipped to the floor. As she bent to retrieve them, she whispered, "Third floor archive, northwest corner, the cabinet with the broken lock." Then she was gone, continuing down the hall as if our encounter had been accidental. The third floor felt abandoned compared to the activity below. Most keepers were occupied with damage control on the main levels, leaving the upper archives unguarded. I found the cabinet Mira had indicated, its lock broken and hanging from the door. Inside were the things they'd been trying so desperately to secure: correspondence between academy administrators and outside authorities, dating back decades. Letters discussing experimental protocols and subject responses. Reports on students transferred to specialized facilities that didn't appear on any official academy documentation. One letter, signed by Thaddeus Aldrich, made my blood run cold. The psychological conditioning shows promising results, though we continue to experience occasional memory breakthrough in approximately 15% of subjects. We recommend immediate transfer of affected individuals to prevent contamination of the broader student population. Another, from an unknown hand. The chemical compounds have been refined according to your specifications. Subjects exposed to the new formulation show complete dissociative episodes within 48 hours, with no subsequent memory recovery documented to date. I stuffed as many documents as I could into my coat, knowing that by morning these cabinets would be empty or destroyed. The Academy's careful system of concealment was collapsing, but they would rebuild it if given the chance. As I headed back toward the main floors, the sounds of disruption grew louder. Voices called from various corridors, some demanding answers, others pleading for help understanding what was happening to them. The Academy's population was waking up, and those in power scrambled to put them back to sleep before the institution's true purpose became undeniable. But it was too late. The chamber's destruction had been like pulling a thread that unraveled the entire fabric of their control. Students were remembering. Documents were surfacing, and the careful balance of ignorance and authority that had sustained this place for so long was finally, irreversibly broken. The chaos that followed stretched across days, each one revealing new fractures in the Academy's careful constructed facade. I watched from windows and doorways as the institution systematically emptied, authorities moving with the desperate efficiency of people trying to contain a fire that had already spread beyond their control. The archivum bore the worst of it. When I ventured there on the second morning, I found shelves stripped bare, their contents scattered across the floor like the aftermath of a storm. Papers lay trampled underfoot, some torn, others bearing boot prints from whoever had rushed through in the dark hours before dawn. "They took everything," Mira whispered, appearing beside me in the doorway. Her face was pale, her usual composure cracked. "Ledgers, correspondence files, even the binding materials from the workshop." I knelt and picked up a fragment of parchment, recognizing the careful script of one of the junior archivists. The page had been ripped from a larger document, leaving only partial sentences about subject responses and conditioning intervals. "Not everything," I said, slipping the fragment into my coat. "They were in too much of a hurry." Through the corridors, people moved with obvious distress. Some carried hastily packed belongings, a few books, personal items wrapped in spare clothing. Others walked empty-handed, their faces bearing the hollow expression of those who had lost more than possessions. I recognized several students from the dining hall. They looked different now, older somehow, as if memories had aged them overnight. "Where are they taking us?" a girl asked one of the keepers escorting a small group toward the main entrance. She couldn't have been more than 16, her voice high with barely controlled panic. "Temporary relocation," the keeper replied, his tone rehearsed. "The Academy is undergoing routine restructuring. You'll be contacted about your academic placement once the process is complete." I had heard those same words in official correspondence, the kind of bureaucratic language designed to obscure rather than explain. But now, Watching the keeper's nervous glances and the tremor in his hand on the girl's shoulder, the lie became transparent. In the east wing, I found evidence of their haste everywhere. Furniture lay overturned, drawers pulled out and emptied. A trail of scattered papers led from the administrative offices to the main corridor, as if someone had dropped pieces while carrying an armload of documents. One page caught my attention. A requisition form for keeper's conveyance, dated just 2 days prior. The destination was listed simply as 7th Annex, Hollows Enclosure, with a note about augmented keeper watch and transfer for an unspecified term under council writ. Miss Blackwell. I turned to find Inspector Harwick approaching, his expression grim. Behind him walked 2 keepers I didn't recognize, their pins freshly polished despite the chaos surrounding us. "You shouldn't be wandering the corridors," he said. "All students are to remain in designated areas until further notice."
"I was looking for my personal effects," I replied, keeping my voice steady. "My quarters were cleared without notice."
"Everything will be returned to you at the appropriate time." His eyes moved to the paper in my hand. "I'll need you to surrender any academy materials you may have collected." I held his gaze for a moment, then extended the requisition form. As he took it, I noticed ink stains on his fingers, as if he'd handled documents all night. "The Academy has served this community for generations," he said, folding the paper carefully. "These temporary disruptions, the augmented keeper watch and transfers to annexes, are necessary to preserve that legacy."
"Of course," I said. "I understand completely."
But I didn't surrender the fragment from the archivum floor, or the other pieces I'd gathered during my wandering. They stayed hidden in my coat, small testimonies to a truth that no amount of official restructuring could erase. As Harwick and his escorts moved on, I continued through the corridors, documenting what I could. In the library, entire sections had been cleared, leaving gaps like missing teeth. The workshop spaces stood empty, their specialized equipment removed so thoroughly that only mounting brackets and disconnected pipes remained. Yet for all their efficiency, they couldn't erase everything. In forgotten corners and overlooked spaces, evidence remained. A page wedged behind a radiator, notes scrawled inside a drawer, fragments of correspondence that had fallen through cracks in floorboards. Each piece told a part of the story they were so desperate to hide. A story of experiments conducted on unwilling subjects, of students who had disappeared into administrative language, of an institution that had perverted its educational mission into something far darker. By the 4th day, the place felt like a ghost itself. Whole wings stood empty, their windows dark. A few remaining staff moved with the mechanical precision of people following emergency protocols, their conversations reduced to whispers and abbreviated phrases. I knew my time was running short. Soon, I too would be relocated, my inconvenient knowledge managed through the same bureaucratic machinery that had processed so many others. But the fragments I'd gathered would survive, hidden where official searches couldn't reach. The truth, once released, had proven impossible to contain completely, and somewhere in those scattered pieces of evidence lay the foundation for exposing what Blackwood Academy had truly become. The morning I left Blackwood Academy, I carried more than my few belongings. Hidden beneath my coat, sewn into the lining of my travel bag, tucked between the pages of approved texts, were the fragments that would outlive the institution's attempts at erasure. Documents bearing witness to what had been done, records that named names and detailed methods, the testimony of those who had participated, willingly or not, in the systematic destruction of inconvenient minds. My carriage waited beyond the rector's causeway. Its driver paid in advance and instructed to ask no questions about our destination. The Academy's Gothic towers rose behind me as I walked the familiar path one final time. But the fog that had surrounded the buildings during my first arrival had lifted. Winter's grip was loosening, and the ancient stones stood exposed under the sky, their secrets no longer hidden in mist. "Miss Blackwell?" The voice belonged to one of the remaining keepers, a woman whose name I'd never learned, but whose face I recognized from the corridors. She approached with measured steps, hands folded before her. "Your departure papers." I took the documents without reading them. Official stamps and signatures meant nothing now. The real record of my time here existed in the evidence I carried, in the connections I'd made between scattered fragments, in the understanding I'd gained of how educational pursuit had been transformed into something far more sinister. "The Academy wishes you well in your future endeavors," she continued, the words hollow and rehearsed. "I'm sure it does." I slid the papers into my coat pocket, feeling the weight of the hidden documents beneath the fabric. "Will there be others leaving today?" Her face softened for the briefest moment, as if sympathy were a reflex she could barely contain. "Some," she said quietly, with the careful economy of someone who had learned the cost of saying too much. "Restructuring, transfers, people are being moved. It's ongoing." As needed. The same phrase they'd used to explain away every disappearance, every transfer, every student who'd simply stopped appearing in the dining hall or the library. I nodded and turned toward the bridge. The carriage wheels clattered against the stone as we crossed the marshlands surrounding Lake Lucht. I pressed my face to the window and looked back at the academy perched on Thorn's Rise. From this distance it appeared almost peaceful, a collection of medieval buildings housing scholarly pursuits, nothing more threatening than dusty books and demanding professors. But I knew better. I knew about the chamber beneath the east cloister, about the chemical compounds designed to fragment memory, about the ritual installations built into the very foundation. I knew about the keepers who'd convinced themselves that erasure was mercy, about the faculty who'd rationalized cruelty as necessity. I knew about my sister, whose notebook fragments had led me to this understanding, whose disappearance had been neither accident nor isolated tragedy. The driver called back through the small window that separated us. His voice was practical, guarded, the way of someone paid to be invisible. "Where to, miss?" I gave him the address I'd memorized weeks ago, a boarding house in the city where questions weren't asked and residents paid for privacy. From there, I would begin the careful work of preservation and revelation. The documents I carried would need to be copied, distributed, placed in hands that could act on their contents. The academy grew smaller behind us, but its influence wouldn't end with distance. Other institutions existed, other places where similar methods might be employed. The knowledge I'd gained at such cost would serve a purpose beyond personal vindication. As the carriage rolled through the countryside, I opened my sister's notebook to the page I'd read countless times. Her handwriting, still clear despite the damage to the paper, described sensations that matched perfectly with the technical specifications I'd found in the workshop records. She'd known what was happening to her, had tried to document it even as her memory was being systematically erased. "They make you forget," she'd written, "but forgetting isn't the same as never having known." The truth, once released, had proven impossible to contain completely, and now it would spread beyond the academy's walls, carried by someone who remembered not just what had been done, but why it could never be allowed to happen again. This has been Shadows in the Halls, written by André Paolin, narrated by Jenica Domanico.